This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I first noticed the crack on December 1st. It was early morning. I had just gotten up. I left my bedroom and walked into the hallway. The hall was narrow and had one old lamp on the ceiling. It was dim, but I could see everything clearly enough. I remember glancing at the wall near the door to my bathroom. There was a thin, dark line on the plaster. It looked about 2 inches long and maybe as thick as a piece of string. I remember touching it with my fingertip. The surface felt dry and rough, not damp or soft. I wondered if maybe there had been some settling in the house. I had bought the place a few years ago, and I knew it was old. I stood there for a moment. I thought about ignoring it. Maybe it was nothing. But I decided to keep it in mind. I washed my face, got dressed, and went to work. At that point, I didn't think too much about it. The next morning, I woke up at about the same time. I went into the hallway. I stopped in front of the wall to check the crack. It seemed a little longer, maybe a few millimeters. I leaned in close. The edges looked sharp and well-defined. It didn't look like normal plaster cracking. I didn't see any discoloration. I didn't feel any moisture. It was just a clean, dark line on a white wall. I tried pressing on the wall beside it. The plaster felt solid. Nothing moved or crumbled. I shrugged. I left it alone and went about my day. Over the next week, the crack got bigger. Every morning, I checked it. By December 7th, it had grown to about 5 inches. It was always slightly longer than the day before. I tried shining a flashlight on it. I tried to see if there was a shadow or a gap behind. I couldn't tell. It was just a crack, but it looked strangely deliberate. The top part of the crack curved a bit to the left, and the bottom part curved a bit to the right. When I looked at it too long, I got uncomfortable. It reminded me of a shape. It never actually resembled a person in detail, but it gave me the feeling of a face, not a smiling face, more like a blank face. But I tried not to think about it too much. By December 10th, I started to feel uneasy. I found myself stopping in front of the crack at night before bed. I would run my hand along the wall, looking for any looseness or signs of structural damage. I never found any. The crack was quiet. There was no sound coming from it. There was no breeze. It was just a line that grew a little bit each day. I considered calling a professional. I even looked up a local handyman's number. But I kept delaying. I thought maybe I was imagining the growth. Maybe it wasn't actually changing. So I started measuring it every morning. I took a small tape measure and recorded the length in a notebook. On December 1st, it had been about 2 inches. By December 11th, it was closer to 7 inches. It didn't grow fast, but it grew every day. I tried painting over it. On December 12th, I got some white paint and a small brush. I applied a thin coat over the crack. I let it dry and checked in the morning. The paint had cracked as well, and the original line was visible through it. The crack was now about 7.5 inches long. The paint didn't cover it. It just highlighted it. I felt a little nervous. I started thinking that something might be inside the wall. Maybe some kind of insect or rodent. But I never heard scratching. I never smelled anything unusual. The wall was silent and solid. I tapped it with my knuckles. It sounded normal. No hollowness that would suggest a large cavity. Just a normal wall. On December 15th, the crack was about 9 inches. It now reached slightly above my eye level. I tried pressing my ear against the wall. I heard nothing except my own breathing. I tried turning off all the lights in the hallway and shining my flashlight directly on the line. It cast a tiny shadow inside, as if the plaster had opened just a fraction of a millimeter. But I couldn't see any depth. It still looked like a surface-level crack. The feeling of being watched grew stronger as the month went on. I know that's not something I can prove, but I felt it in my shoulders and the back of my neck. I started looking behind me whenever I walked through the hallway. I started walking faster in that area. At night, I made sure all the doors were locked, even though I knew the crack was inside my house. I had nightmares about it. I dreamed that it widened and revealed something behind the wall, but I couldn't describe what it was. In the morning, I always felt a knot in my stomach when I approached the hallway. By December 20th, the crack was about 12 inches. Now it stretched vertically in a slightly uneven line, about the length of my forearm. I noticed that the shape of the crack was becoming more complicated. It wasn't a straight line. It had tiny branches or hairline splits extending from the main line. They were subtle, but they made me think of wrinkles. I touched them with my fingertip. They felt the same as before, just rough plaster edges. I tried patching it with some filler on December 21st. I pressed the filler into the crack and smoothed it over. I let it dry overnight. The next morning the filler had cracked too, following the exact line of the original crack. It looked almost worse. I scraped it off. I felt frustrated and anxious. I didn't know what was causing it, and I didn't know how to stop it. On December 22nd, I heard a noise in the hallway in the middle of the night. I was lying in bed. I suddenly sat up because I thought I heard a creaking sound near the corridor. I walked out quietly. I saw nothing unusual. The crack looked the same. I stood there for a few minutes watching it. Nothing moved. I went back to bed. December 23rd, the crack was about 14 inches. It now reached above my head and stopped roughly at chest height from the floor. I tried to focus on practical steps. Maybe I could call a structural engineer. But it was almost Christmas. People were busy. I didn't want strangers in my house right now. I decided to wait until after the holiday. I put the thought aside. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling and just watch TV or clean the kitchen. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, I woke up and checked the crack as usual. It hadn't grown. I measured it 3 times. It stayed at about 14 inches. The edges looked exactly the same as the day before. For the first time, it hadn't changed overnight. I felt a sudden chill in my arms. I didn't feel relief. I expected to feel better if it stopped growing, but I didn't. I felt more worried. I didn't know what it meant. Why would it stop now? I spent most of that day avoiding the hallway. I stayed in the living room, watching old shows on TV. I made myself a quick dinner. I tried not to think about it, but I had to pass by the corridor to get to my bedroom. Each time I went through, I kept my eyes straight ahead, not looking at the crack. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to think about it. That night I tried to sleep. I woke up a few times thinking I heard something, but it was quiet. No new sounds, no voices, just my own breathing. I got up around midnight and checked the hallway. The crack was still there, unchanged. I felt my stomach tighten. I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until I fell asleep. On December 25th, Christmas morning, I got up early. I felt tired. I stepped into the hallway and looked at the crack. It was still there, still the same length. It hadn't disappeared. It hadn't grown. It just was there, silent and intact. I stood very close to it. My nose was a few inches from the wall. I couldn't see anything unusual inside. It was just dark and thin. I ran my hand over it, pressing slightly. The plaster felt the same. There was no give, no debris, nothing that came off on my fingers. I stood there for a long time, just staring. I tried knocking on the wall again, firmly, solid. I tried listening with my ear pressed against it. Just silence. I was shaking a little. not from cold. My hands felt clammy. My heart rate was high. I looked around, checking if anything else was out of place. Everything looked normal. The hallway was the same as always, except for that crack. I felt a strong urge to do something drastic. I wanted to break the plaster open with a hammer, but I was scared that I might damage something important. Also, I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't do that. I don't know why. It didn't make sense. It was just a crack, but I was too nervous. I backed away and went to the living room again. All day I tried to ignore it. I turned on the TV, watched some random shows, tried to eat something. I paced around the living room. I sat down, got up again, checked my phone, looked out the window. It was a quiet day outside. Everything felt normal, but inside I felt tense and uncertain. Around midday, I decided to measure it again. I walked back to the hallway with my tape measure. It was still about 14 inches. I wrote it down in my notebook. I flipped through the pages and looked at the progression. 2 inches on December 1st, gradually increasing, and then stopping on December 24th. It didn't form any pattern I could understand. I shut the notebook and put it aside. I touched the crack again, running my fingertip along it slowly, from top to bottom. I felt a slight dryness in my throat. My heart was beating fast. I noticed that the hallway was silent. Normally, I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen or a faint noise from outside. But right then, I heard nothing. It felt like the air was heavier. I didn't know if I was imagining it or not. I cleared my throat and stepped back. I spent the afternoon trying to keep busy. I cleaned the bathroom. I washed some dishes. I wiped down the windows. I tried calling a friend, but nobody answered. It was Christmas Day, after all. People were with their families. I was alone with a strange crack in my hallway. It was not a good feeling. At some point, I sat down on the couch and just stared at the floor. My legs felt weak. I tried to calm myself down. I reasoned that it was just a crack. Maybe the house's foundation had shifted slightly. Maybe it would just stay that way forever. Just a crack in the wall. Nothing more. But I couldn't convince myself. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that line. Every time I tried to relax, I felt that tightness in my chest. In the evening, I turned on all the lights in the house. I walked to the hallway and stood there, watching the crack under bright light. It looked the same. I rubbed my eyes. I pinched the bridge of my nose. I was tired. I needed sleep. But I didn't want to go to bed. I feared that if I slept, something would change again. Maybe I would wake up and find it larger, or find something else. But I had to sleep eventually. Before going to bed, I placed a small piece of tape on the floor right at the bottom of the crack. I wanted a reference point. I wanted to see if anything would change overnight. Then I went to my room and lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. My body felt heavy. I tried to slow my breathing, inhaling and exhaling quietly. I listened for any sounds. I heard nothing unusual, just silence. I thought about the next day. I thought about calling someone to check the wall. I thought about trying to open it up to see what was inside. But the idea of doing that made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure why. I had no logical reason for feeling this way. It was just a crack. But I felt watched. I felt that every time I walked through that hallway, something was aware of me. I couldn't explain it. I had no evidence of anything like that. I just felt it. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The house was quiet. The crack remained on the wall, unchanged, silent, dark, and unmoving. It did not go away. It did not grow. It stayed there as I lay in my bed, trying not to think about it. It was still there when I finally closed my eyes. I noticed the sound on December 1st, around 3 in the morning. I had gotten up to use the bathroom. The house was cold and quiet. While walking back to my bedroom, I heard a creak. It was not a usual floorboard noise. It was loud and came from the staircase. I stopped and listened. The house was old, but the stairs had never made that sound before. I stayed still for a while, holding my breath, waiting to see if it would happen again. Nothing else happened. I returned to bed and tried to forget about it. The next night, I woke up at around the same time. I felt thirsty. I got up and went to the kitchen. On my way back, as I passed the stairs, the same step creaked. It was the third step from the bottom. The noise was sharp, almost like someone stepping on it. I stood there in the dark, looking at that step. The wood looked normal. There were no cracks, no loose nails. I pressed down on it with my foot. It made a slight noise, but not as loud as before. I shrugged and went back to bed. This happened every night for the next few days, always after midnight, always that same step. During the day, the step never made a sound. I walked up and down the stairs several times to test it. It stayed silent. By December 5th, I was starting to get uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it, but I kept waking up at odd hours, and each time I passed by the staircase, I heard the creak again. It was as if someone invisible was stepping there at night, waiting for me. I examined the step carefully on December 6th. I crouched down with a flashlight. I checked for loose boards, cracks, or anything unusual. The wood looked fine, solid. I tried pressing my full weight on it. I even bounced a little. Nothing, no sound. It felt normal. I looked underneath the staircase, shining the flashlight into the darkness. I saw no signs of damage or rodents or anything else, just the dusty underside of old wood. That night, it happened again. This time, I didn't need to get up for anything. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. I heard the creak clearly, coming from the staircase. My bedroom door was open, and I could hear the faint groan of wood from down the hall. I got up, heart pounding a bit. I walked to the stairs and turned on the hall light. The step looked the same. I stood there, listening. No more sound, just the low hum of the heating. I felt uneasy. I returned to bed and lay awake for a long time. As the days passed, the pattern continued. Each night, usually between midnight and 1 in the morning, the step creaked. Sometimes just once, sometimes twice. Never more than that. I tried not to make a big deal out of it. I told myself it was the cold, the temperature changes, the old wood shrinking at night. But it still bothered me. By December 10th, I started feeling tired. I was losing sleep. I got nervous before going to bed. I would lie there, waiting for that sound, expecting it. Even if I tried to ignore it, I couldn't help listening for it. My body tensed up each night when the clock approached midnight, and without fail, the sound came. A single creak, maybe two. Always that same step. I didn't tell anyone about it. I lived alone. I didn't want to call a carpenter or a friend to show them a step that only creaked at night. They would think I was imagining things, so I dealt with it myself. I tried putting some talcum powder on the step, thinking maybe it would reduce friction. It did nothing. I placed a heavy object on it overnight, just a small chair. I hoped maybe keeping pressure on it would stop the noise, but the next night I still heard it. The chair didn't move, and the step still creaked. Around December 15th, the frequency increased. I started hearing it not just once a night, but 2 or 3 times in a row. Always within the same hour. I would get out of bed, rush to the hallway, and try to catch it happening. But I never saw any movement. The step was always still. There was never any sign of what caused the noise. I tried recording it with my phone. I left my phone in the hallway overnight, hitting record before I slept. In the morning I checked the recording. The sound was there, faint but clear. A quick creak in the silence. It sounded like weight being applied and removed. My hands felt sweaty as I listened. It was proof that I wasn't imagining it. As Christmas approached, I felt more on edge. The nights were colder. The house felt quieter. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The step noise was too consistent, too deliberate. It didn't sound like random settling. It sounded like footsteps, but there was no one else in the house. I checked the locks, the windows, the doors. Everything was secure. I thought about staying awake all night, just to see if I could catch something in the act, but I was too tired and stressed. By December 20th, I started feeling real fear. Each night, I lay in bed, feeling my heart race as the clock hit midnight. I would count the seconds, waiting for the noise. It always came. Sometimes just once, sometimes twice. I started sweating when I heard it. My mouth went dry. I thought about going to a hotel for a few days, but that felt ridiculous. I didn't want to run away from my own home just because of a noisy step. I tried shouting at the staircase once. On December 21st, after hearing the creak, I jumped out of bed, ran to the stairs and yelled, "Who's there?" My voice sounded shaky. Nothing answered. I stepped on that same stair, pressing down hard, expecting something to happen, but nothing did. Just silence. I felt foolish. I went back to my room and tried to calm down. On December 22nd, I took a closer look at the step during the day. I removed the small carpet runner that covered part of the staircase. I looked at the boards around it. Everything seemed solid. I tapped the wood. It felt strong. I tried tightening any visible screws on the banister. I tried rubbing some oil on the sides, thinking maybe wood friction was causing a squeak. I wanted to eliminate any possibilities, but that night, I still heard it. December 23rd was a bad night. I woke at 12:30 a.m. to a loud creak, louder than before. It sounded like someone putting their full weight on that step. I was startled. My heart pounded. I sat up in bed, breathing hard. I listened. Another creak, softer this time. I felt a chill on my skin. I got up slowly, grabbed a flashlight, and walked into the hallway. I turned on the light. The step looked normal. I walked down the staircase, checking the front door, the living room, the kitchen. Everything was empty and locked. I went back upstairs and stood at the top, looking down at that step. It was the third one from the bottom. It didn't move. I touched it with my foot. A tiny sound, but nothing like I'd heard. I stood there for a long time, feeling uneasy. Eventually, I went back to bed. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, I expected the creaking as usual. I lay in bed, waiting for it. Midnight passed. Nothing happened. I waited another 30 minutes. Still nothing. I got out of bed and went to check the step at about 1 a.m. It was silent. I pressed it gently with my foot. A faint noise, but no louder than you'd expect from old wood. I went back to bed, confused. Why had it stopped now? It had been so consistent. I didn't sleep much. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what changed. The next morning, December 25th, I got up early. I felt exhausted and tense. I went to the staircase first thing. I checked the step again. No changes. The wood looked the same. I walked on it back and forth. It made a normal creaking sound when I put my full weight on it, but nothing alarming. I tried to relax. Maybe it was over. Maybe something had shifted inside the wood or the house's frame, and now it was settled. I spent Christmas morning in the living room, trying to enjoy a quiet day. I made coffee, watched some old TV shows, and tried not to think too much. But I couldn't fully relax. Around midday, I decided to go upstairs for something. As I passed the staircase, My body tensed. I put one foot on the first step, then the second, then the third. A soft creak. It was the same step, but now the sound was very mild, not like at night. Still, it made my shoulders stiffen. I paused there, standing on the staircase. I listened to the house. Everything was silent. The heating hummed quietly. Outside, I could hear a distant car passing by. Inside, just me and the stairs. I pressed my foot on the step a bit harder. Creak. Just a normal old step sound, nothing more. I went upstairs and grabbed a book I wanted. When I came back down, I stepped carefully again. Another quiet creak. My heart sped up for a moment, but it wasn't the same feeling as before. It didn't sound like someone else was stepping there. It sounded like an old step under my foot. That night, December 25th, I waited again. I stayed up late, just to be sure. Midnight came and went. I stayed awake until almost 2 in the morning. No loud creaks, no unexplained noises, just the normal faint groans of an old house. I tried to feel relieved, but I couldn't shake the memory of those nights. I had recordings of it. I had heard it clearly. It wasn't my imagination, but now it was gone or back to normal. The next morning, I examined the staircase again. I wanted to see if anything had changed overnight. Everything looked exactly the same as always. The same grain in the wood, the same old varnish. Nothing unusual. I pressed down on the step. It made a small creak, just like the others if I pressed hard enough. But nothing like the mysterious midnight noises. I decided to move on and not think about it too much. The holiday was ending soon. I had other things to do. Over the following days, I slept better. No loud creaks woke me up. I still felt a little uneasy whenever I used the stairs late at night, but I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind. I told myself it was just one of those weird things old houses do. Maybe the cold weather affected the wood in strange ways. Maybe some slight shift in temperature or humidity caused it. I didn't have a better explanation, and I didn't want to obsess over it. By the end of December, the staircase felt normal again, just an old wooden staircase in an old house. I still remembered the fear and confusion I had felt, the way my body reacted to that strange noise, the way I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, expecting to see someone on the stairs, but nothing ever appeared. There was never any sign of intrusion or damage, just a sound that came and went on its own. Sometimes, late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I would stand at the top of the stairs and look down. I would listen carefully, waiting for any creak. Most nights, I heard nothing but silence. On rare occasions, I might hear a faint settling noise, but nothing like before. I learned to live with it. I never found a real explanation. The step that creaked so loudly in December now acted like any other step in the house. There was no reason for it. I never discovered what caused it. It bothered me, but I had no proof of anything strange, just a memory and a recording of a creak in the middle of the night. In the end, life went on. The house stayed quiet. The staircase remained in place, the same old wood, the same old steps, one of which had given me so many sleepless nights. I stayed alert for a while, expecting the sound to return, but it never did. I just moved forward, trying not to think too hard about what happened. It was over, and that was all that mattered. I first noticed it on December 1st. I woke up early, went into the living room, and saw that the large wooden cabinet near the wall had shifted slightly. It was not a huge difference, maybe just a few centimeters, but I knew where I had placed it the week before. It had been flush against the wall, aligned neatly with a small table next to it. Now it was off by a bit. I stood there, looking at it. feeling a slight tension in my stomach. I tried pushing the cabinet to see if it was loose or if the floor was uneven. It was heavy, solid wood, old and stable. I had to put real effort into moving it. After a few hard pushes, I got it back to its original position. My arms felt sore. I stepped back and checked the alignment again. Perfect. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had bumped into it while cleaning and not noticed. The next morning, December 2nd, I found the cabinet moved again. Same direction, a few centimeters away from the wall. This time, I felt my heart beat faster. I knew I hadn't touched it. The day before, I was careful. I avoided going near it after pushing it back. Yet here it was, moved again. I crouched down and checked the floor. Hardwood, a bit old, but no signs of warping. I tried pushing the cabinet from different angles. It took strength to budge it. There was no way it was sliding by itself. I wondered if there was some vibration from outside. But I hadn't felt any tremors. I decided not to mention it to anyone. I lived alone. I thought maybe I was tired or stressed. But deep down, I knew something was off. Over the next few days, this pattern repeated. Each morning, I'd find the cabinet slightly further out of place, always in the same direction, always a few more centimeters from the wall. By December 5th, it had moved at least 20 centimeters from its original spot. I tried marking the floor with a piece of tape to track its movement. Every morning, I found the cabinet beyond the tape mark, a bit closer to the front door. On December 6th, I got serious. I examined the cabinet closely, inside and out. It was an old piece I had inherited. It had drawers and a solid back panel. I checked inside the drawers for any signs of rodents or something that might shift the weight. Nothing. Just some old tablecloths and a few candles. I checked the wall socket behind it, looking for loose electrical wiring that might cause some vibration. Everything looked normal. I tried staying up late. On December 7th, I stayed awake until around 2 in the morning, sitting in the dark living room, watching the cabinet. I sat on a chair, arms crossed, determined to catch it in the act. Nothing happened. At some point, I nodded off. When I woke up in the morning, the cabinet had moved again. I felt a chill in my chest. Somehow it had happened while I slept, despite my efforts to watch it. I thought about setting up a camera. On December 8th, I placed my phone on a shelf across the room, recording video all night. In the morning, I checked the footage. The video ran for a few hours until the battery died. Before the battery cut out, I saw nothing. The cabinet remained still, but when I woke up, I found it moved again. I cursed quietly under my breath. I needed a better solution. I dug out an old webcam that I could connect to my laptop and keep plugged in all night. On December 9th, I set it up, pointing directly at the cabinet, with a nightlight in the room so I could see something on the video. On December 10th morning, I reviewed the footage. The webcam recorded the entire night. For hours, nothing happened. Then, around 3 in the morning, the footage got weird. I saw a slight flicker. The image distorted for a second. When it came back, the cabinet had moved about 2 centimeters from its previous position. The movement itself didn't appear on the recording. One frame it was in place, the next frame it had shifted. There was no sound, no shadow, just a glitch in the image. I replayed it multiple times. The camera didn't capture the motion, just the result. My hands shook as I watched this. I felt sweat on my forehead. I realized something was definitely not normal. I tried to stay calm. I told myself it could be a technical glitch, a camera malfunction. But why would the cabinet always be moved in the morning? The marks on the floor showed it traveling closer to the door each day. By December 12th, It had moved over 1/2 meter from its original position. It was now noticeably out of place, no longer just a minor shift. I tried blocking the cabinet's path. On December 13th, I placed a heavy coffee table in front of it, hoping to prevent it from moving. The next morning, I found the coffee table slightly pushed aside and the cabinet moved again. The cabinet had somehow overcome the obstacle. This made my chest tighten. The idea that something invisible or silent was pushing this heavy piece of furniture around at night terrified me. I didn't hear scraping noises at night, which was strange. One would expect a heavy cabinet moving across a wooden floor to make a sound, but I heard nothing. I tried listening very carefully on December 14th. I went to bed but kept my ears open. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard a faint scratching sound, very soft, almost like cloth dragging on wood. I jumped out of bed and ran to the living room with a flashlight. The cabinet stood there, still. I checked the floor with the light, looking for fresh scuff marks. The next morning, I saw that it had moved again by a few more centimeters. The tension in my body grew stronger each day. As December approached Christmas, I noticed a pattern. The cabinet was moving toward the front door. Each night it shifted a bit closer. By December 17th, it was almost in the center of the room. I tried to understand why. Was it heading somewhere specific? The front door led outside. Was this piece of furniture trying to leave? That thought made my hands tremble and my throat go dry. It sounded insane, but the facts were there. It moved every night, always in the same direction. I considered calling someone. But what would I say? That my furniture was moving by itself at night? People would think I was losing it. I tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe vibrations from large trucks passing by at night. But I lived on a quiet street. Maybe some kind of prank. But I lived alone, and I kept everything locked. I checked my windows and doors for signs of forced entry. Nothing. No footprints. No fingerprints. Nothing out of place except the moving cabinet. On December 20th, the cabinet was now right in front of the door, blocking it partially. I struggled to get out that morning. I had to push the cabinet aside to open the door. It took effort. I grunted and strained my muscles. This was no easy push. Whatever moved it at night had more strength than I did. By December 22nd, I was sleeping poorly. I was anxious and tense all the time. I tried staying up again, using strong coffee to keep awake. I sat in the living room with all the lights off, watching the cabinet. I kept glancing at the clock. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock, then 2. Nothing happened. I started feeling drowsy around 2:30. I pinched my arm to stay awake. I didn't want to miss it this time. At some point, my eyelids grew heavy, and I guess I dozed off for a second. When I snapped awake, I looked at the cabinet. It had moved again. I cursed out loud, my heart pounding. Whatever was happening, it only occurred when I wasn't fully alert. On December 23rd, I decided to remove all other furniture from the living room. I dragged my couch, chairs, and coffee table into another room. I wanted to see if anything else moved. Now the living room was almost empty, just the cabinet, the walls, and the door. I placed tape on the floor in a grid pattern. I wanted to measure the exact distance it moved. I recorded the positions in a notebook. That night, I tried sleeping in the living room itself, lying on the floor with a pillow and a blanket, facing the cabinet. I woke up in the morning with a stiff neck. The cabinet had moved again by a few centimeters. I never heard it. I never saw it. My eyes must have closed at some point. The tape marks showed the exact shift. It was now almost touching the front door handle. I felt my stomach churn. This was not random. It was heading straight for the door. December 24th came, Christmas Eve. I tried not to think about the holiday. I focused on the problem at hand. I pushed the cabinet all the way back to its original spot once more. It was hard work. I measured it, wrote down the position, and took a photo with my phone. I wanted evidence of its starting point. That night, I locked all doors and windows. I turned off every light. I set up 3 cameras at different angles, all plugged in, all recording. I even set my phone alarm to ring every 30 minutes so I wouldn't sleep too deeply. I was determined to catch something. The night passed slowly. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Each time the alarm rang, I checked the cameras. The cabinet stayed still. I started feeling hope that maybe it wouldn't move. Maybe this nonsense was over. But around 3:30 a.m., I got a terrible headache and had to run to the bathroom to splash water on my face. I was gone for maybe 5 minutes. When I returned, the cabinet stood right in front of the door. It had moved several feet in those few minutes. The cameras showed nothing, just the same glitchy frames as before, a small flicker, and then the cabinet in a new spot. My hands shook as I approached it. I didn't know what to do. I tried to push it away from the door, but it felt heavier than ever. I gave up and went to bed, leaving it there. I couldn't fight it anymore. My body was tired, and my mind was numb with fear and confusion. On December 25th morning, I got up expecting to see the cabinet blocking the door, but when I entered the living room, I froze. The cabinet was back in its original position, perfectly aligned against the wall, exactly how it had been on December 1st before all this started. The tape on the floor was still there, and I could see it matched the initial marks. It was as if it had never moved. I stared for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. I pushed on the cabinet lightly. It was stable and heavy as always. I checked the cameras. The recording ended sometime during the night with no sign of movement. It was like the cabinet had reset itself. My legs felt weak, and I sat down on the floor, breathing hard. I felt anger and relief mixed together. Why would it do this for weeks and then suddenly return to normal? I spent the morning cleaning up. I removed the tape, put the furniture back in place, and tried to act normal. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something had happened in my home for almost the entire month, something I couldn't explain. The cabinet had moved each night, inching closer and closer to the front door, only to return to its original place on Christmas Day. It made no sense. I didn't know how to feel. I was still scared, but also relieved that it was over. The cabinet stayed put after that. No more movements. I checked every morning for weeks, and it never shifted again. I couldn't forget the experience, though. Each time I walked by it, I remembered those nights. I remembered the tension in my chest, the sweat on my palms, the frustration of not catching it in action. I never found a logical explanation. I kept the recordings, though they showed nothing except a strange flicker. I considered calling someone, but who? A paranormal investigator? I felt too embarrassed. I decided to keep quiet and move on. Over time, the fear faded, but the memory remained. I still live in the same house. The cabinet remains in its spot, unmoved. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up and think I hear a soft scraping sound. But when I check, everything is normal. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks, or maybe it's something else I'll never understand. In the end, I learned to accept that it happened. I have no proof beyond some strange recordings and my own memory. No one got hurt. Nothing broke. The cabinet ended up back where it started. But the feeling that I was not alone in that house during December never completely left me. I live with it, quietly, hoping it never happens again. I noticed the changes on December 1st. I woke up early, made coffee, and walked into the living room. I glanced at the Christmas tree in the corner. I had decorated it the night before with care. Everything had been placed the way I liked. Small red balls on the lower branches, larger ornaments near the middle, a few candy cane shapes at the top. The lights were all white. The arrangement looked neat and balanced. But that morning, I saw that two ornaments had switched places. A silver ball that I had hung on the right side was now on the left. A small wooden angel that had been near the bottom was now somewhere near the top. At first, I thought I had made a mistake. Maybe I didn't remember correctly. I shook my head and decided it wasn't worth worrying about. I had probably decorated in a hurry and forgot where I put them. The next day, December 2nd, I noticed another change. This time, a few candy cane ornaments had moved around. One that I knew was at eye level had shifted to a lower branch. A star-shaped ornament, which I had placed near the trunk, was now dangling toward the front. I touched the branches, feeling the plastic needles. They were stiff and cold. Nothing seemed broken. All the hooks were still there. I frowned, feeling a slight tension in my chest. On December 3rd, I woke up determined to confirm if something was off. The night before, I took a photo of the tree with my phone. I had a reference now. In the morning, I compared the photo to the actual arrangement. Yes, things had moved again. This time it was more noticeable. At least 4 ornaments had changed places. I swallowed hard. My palms felt sweaty. I tried to think logically. Maybe I brushed against the tree while passing by, but I knew I had been careful. I rarely touched the tree after finishing the initial decoration. The pattern continued each day. Every morning in December, I found 1 or 2 ornaments displaced. By December 5th, I started feeling uneasy. I took a series of photos each night before going to bed. Then I compared them to what I saw in the morning. Each time, ornaments moved without any sign of someone entering my home. I lived alone. The doors were locked. The windows were locked. No one had spare keys. There was no sign of forced entry or anyone sneaking in. Yet the changes were real. On December 7th, I tried an experiment. I removed 1 ornament before sleeping and placed it on the coffee table. In the morning, that ornament was back on the tree, hanging from a branch, but not the one where I had originally placed it. It was now higher, closer to the top. This made my stomach tighten. Something, or someone, was rearranging my decorations. I felt a chill on my neck and arms. I decided to record video. On December 8th, I set up my phone on a shelf, facing the tree. I left a small lamp on so it wouldn't be completely dark. I recorded all night. In the morning, I played back the video. For hours, nothing happened. Then, at around 3 a.m., the video flickered. For a moment, it went blurry. When it stabilized, I saw that some ornaments had changed positions. The actual movement wasn't captured. One frame they were in one place, the next frame they were elsewhere. No figure appeared, no sound. Just the ornaments shifting positions as if the video had jumped forward. I replayed that footage several times, feeling my heart pound. It resembled what happened with the cabinet in my other story, but now it was about ornaments. I tried not to panic. I considered that maybe the phone malfunctioned, but I had proof in front of me. The tree looked different now. More ornaments had moved. I rubbed my forehead, trying to stay calm. As days passed, I noticed a pattern in the rearrangements. By December 10th, the ornaments weren't just randomly scattered. They seemed to form vague shapes or lines. The positions looked intentional. I stood in front of the tree, staring at it, trying to decipher what I was seeing. The ornaments formed some kind of uneven pattern, not a word, not a clear symbol, but something that felt deliberate. This made my chest feel tight, my breathing shallow. I tried removing more ornaments at night. On December 12th, I took off half the ornaments and put them in a box in another room. In the morning, I found some of them placed back on the tree, while others remained in the box. The ones on the tree were arranged in a strange vertical line along one side of the tree. I swallowed hard and wiped sweat from my brow. I felt like I was being challenged or teased by something I couldn't see. By December 15th, nearly all the ornaments had been rearranged. The original design I had planned was completely gone. Each morning, I found a new configuration, sometimes symmetrical, sometimes just slightly off balance. I was sleeping poorly. I was anxious and jumpy. At night, I lay in bed, listening for noises in the living room. I heard nothing unusual, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft creaks of the house settling. No footsteps, no whispering, no rustling of branches. Nothing. On December 17th, I tried staying up all night. I drank coffee and sat in the corner of the living room, half hidden behind a chair, watching the tree. Around 2:30 a.m., my eyes felt heavy. I rubbed them, trying to stay alert. I thought I saw a slight tremor in the branches. I leaned forward, holding my breath. The tree didn't move again. I blinked several times, trying to focus. Suddenly, I must have nodded off, because when I checked my watch again, it was 4 a.m. I rushed to the tree. Some ornaments had changed position again, forming a neat triangular pattern. I cursed under my breath, frustrated. The tension increased each day. By December 20th, the tree looked completely different from my original design. Most of the ornaments formed symmetrical shapes around the trunk. Small ones on one side, larger ones on the other, all arranged in pairs or lines. It was unsettling. I felt a knot in my stomach every time I entered the room. I started feeling a presence whenever I looked at the tree. Nothing visible, just a sensation that I wasn't alone. I got goosebumps on my arms. I tried talking out loud. On December 21st, I stood in front of the tree and said, "Stop messing with my decorations." My voice sounded shaky. I waited for a response. Nothing happened. I felt stupid, but also scared. My hands trembled as I adjusted an ornament that had been moved that morning. I tried placing it back where I wanted it, but I knew it wouldn't stay there. On December 22nd, I removed all ornaments and locked them in a closet. I thought maybe if I took them away, nothing could move them. In the morning, I found several ornaments back on the tree's branches. The closet was still locked, and the key was with me. Yet somehow, a few ornaments had reappeared on the tree, arranged in a tight cluster near the top. I felt lightheaded. I had no explanation for this. As Christmas approached, I realized that I had no control. Whatever was happening would continue no matter what I did. By December 23rd, the entire set of ornaments was back on the tree, arranged in a nearly perfect symmetrical pattern. The colors alternated in a precise sequence, reds and golds on one side, silvers and blues on the other. It looked deliberate and unnatural. My breathing was shallow, and I felt sweat running down my back. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, I decided not to resist. I looked at the tree one last time before going to bed. The ornaments formed a pattern that looked almost like a lattice of colors around the branches. I took a picture. I didn't even bother moving anything. I just locked my bedroom door and tried to sleep, hoping that it would end somehow. When I woke up on December 25th, I felt a strange calm. I opened my bedroom door and walked into the living room. The tree stood there, decorated exactly as I had originally done weeks before. Every ornament was in the place I had first chosen. The patterns and rearrangements were gone. It looked normal, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there for a long time, staring, my mouth dry. I touched the ornaments. They were secure and stable. None were out of place. I ran my finger along a branch, feeling the rough plastic needles, making sure it was real. It was. The tension in my body eased slightly, but my hands still shook. I knew what I had seen. The photos and videos I had taken were proof. But now, on Christmas morning, it was all back to normal. I spent that day trying to act normal, but I felt uneasy. I checked the lock on the closet where I had stored the ornaments. It was locked as I had left it, yet they were back on the tree now. I looked at my camera footage from the previous night. Nothing showed the ornaments returning to their original positions. Just another flicker in the video, and then everything was in place. Over the next few days, nothing happened. I kept the tree up until New Year's, half expecting something else to move. Nothing did. Eventually, I took the tree down, packed the ornaments into boxes, and stored them away. I felt relief as I sealed the box and placed it in the attic. I hoped I wouldn't see such odd behavior again. In the weeks and months after, I tried to forget what happened, but the memory stayed with me. I remembered how my heart raced each morning when I checked the tree, how I felt sick to my stomach when I saw those strange patterns, how I couldn't catch anything in the act, only the results. It bothered me that I had no explanation. I considered telling a friend or a relative about it, but I knew they would laugh or think I was joking, so I kept it to myself. I had no desire to be ridiculed or doubted. I had my photos and videos, but even that might not convince anyone. It could look like a prank. Besides, I didn't want to relive the anxiety. Now, I sit here months later, remembering the events. The tree was ordinary before December. The ornaments were simple, store-bought items, nothing special. Yet something had manipulated them, rearranging them into patterns I never created. It only happened during December, growing more complex as Christmas approached, and then vanished on Christmas Day, as if it never occurred. I can't explain it. I have no logical answer. It was real. I saw it with my own eyes. I felt the fear and confusion. I know it wasn't my imagination, but I have to live with the uncertainty. The ornaments are packed away, and the tree is dismantled. Life goes on. Yet I remember the tension, the sweat on my palms, the tightness in my chest every morning as I entered that living room. It taught me to be more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I still look at decorations differently now. I don't assume they'll stay where I put them. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear a faint rustle of branches, but maybe it's just my memory playing tricks. I haven't seen anything move since then, but the sense of unease never fully went away. It's just quieter now, resting in the back of my mind. That's the whole story. I have no conclusion, no solution, just what happened and how it felt. I can only hope it never happens again. I first noticed the glow on December 1st, just after midnight. I had gone outside to throw out some trash. The air was cold, and I could see my breath. I stood there for a moment, looking at the old lantern that hung on the porch. It was a decorative piece I'd had for years. It had never worked. There was no bulb in it and no wiring left inside. I kept it for the look. That night, I saw a faint light inside it, a weak, pale glow. It lasted only a few minutes. I stood there, hands in my pockets, watching. It made no sound. I finally went back inside, confused, but not too alarmed. The next night, December 2nd, I checked again around midnight. I didn't have to go out, but I opened the front door and leaned out, looking at the lantern. It glowed again, the same faint light as before. This time I stayed outside longer, maybe 10 minutes. The glow faded gradually until the lantern was dark again. I went back inside, trying to understand. The lantern had no candle, no battery, no wiring. It was just an empty shell of metal and glass, yet it glowed. On December 3rd, I decided to inspect it up close. Before midnight, I took a chair and placed it under the lantern so I could reach it easily. I waited inside until around 12. Then I stepped out quietly. The lantern glowed again, slightly brighter than before. I stood on the chair and leaned in close. I could see a dim light inside, as if there were a tiny ember. I tapped the metal frame. It was cold. I tried to open the small door on the front of the lantern. It was stuck. I pulled harder, and it finally opened with a squeak. Inside, I saw nothing but empty space, no source of light. Yet my eyes still detected a faint glow. I reached my hand in. I felt only cold air, no warmth. I pulled my hand out, feeling a chill run through me. The glow slowly faded after a few minutes. On December 4th, the glow was a bit stronger. I noticed it now appeared almost exactly at midnight, give or take a few minutes. It lasted a bit longer too, maybe 15 minutes. I tried filming it with my phone. The camera picked up a faint light inside the lantern's glass, but not very clearly. I watched the video later and saw that the light just went away suddenly. By December 6th, the glow had become brighter. It still wasn't enough to illuminate anything around it, but I could see it clearly from inside the house if I stood by the window. I kept the lights off inside, so I could watch it in the dark. It appeared at midnight and lasted about 20 minutes now. Each night it stayed a bit longer and grew a bit brighter. No sound, no smell, just that pale, silent glow. On December 8th, I tried to figure out if there was some natural explanation. Maybe light from a distant street lamp or a reflection from a passing car. But the lantern was on a covered porch. Light from outside sources would have shone on the outside of the lantern, not inside it. I also tried shielding it with my hand. The glow remained inside, unaffected by outside interference. By December 10th, the glow lasted nearly half an hour. I began feeling uneasy. I started checking the porch before midnight just to confirm nothing else was happening. Everything was normal until the glow began. When it started, I felt a slight chill on my skin, but maybe that was just the cold air. I could hear distant traffic, the usual nighttime sounds. Nothing strange, just that light in an old lantern that shouldn't have been able to light up. On December 12th, I tried removing the lantern from its hook. I thought maybe there was some electronic device hidden inside that I'd never noticed. I climbed on the chair, grabbed the lantern by its top ring, and lifted it. It came off the hook easily. I brought it inside. Under bright indoor lights, I examined it thoroughly. It was just metal and glass, no compartments, no wires. I opened the small door and looked at every inch. Nothing. I shook it gently. No rattling. Just a simple lantern frame. Satisfied, I hung it back outside. That night, the lantern glowed again, right on schedule. This time I felt a knot in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I stayed outside longer, my breath fogging up in the cold. I leaned close, watching the glow. I noticed that as the days passed, it was growing brighter at a steady pace. Soon it might be bright enough to see clearly from the street. I didn't like that idea. I didn't want attention. I had no explanation. My heart beat faster. On December 15th, the glow lasted almost an hour. It was definitely stronger now. I tried tapping on the lantern while it glowed. It made a dull sound. The glow didn't flicker or react. I spoke softly, just to see if my voice would have any effect. Nothing happened. I stood there, feeling stupid and nervous. My fingers were numb from the cold. I went inside and locked the door. On December 17th, I woke up early and went to check the lantern for any residue. During the day, it was as normal as ever, just a lifeless object. I tapped it, shook it, inspected the glass. Nothing unusual. But that night, at midnight, the glow returned, brighter than ever. It lasted about an hour and 15 minutes. I felt anxious now. I started having trouble sleeping, thinking about it. Each night it got brighter and lasted longer. What would happen on Christmas? On December 20th, I considered bringing the lantern inside at midnight to see if the glow would vanish once away from the porch. At 11:50 p.m., I took the lantern down and brought it into my living room. I placed it on a side table and turned off all the lights. I waited. Midnight came. The lantern began to glow, right there in my house. I watched it from a few feet away. It glowed steadily for over an hour, then faded. When it was done, I lifted it and took it back outside. My hands were shaking. I felt sweat on my forehead. This thing glowed anywhere. It didn't need the porch. On December 22nd, the glow was now strong enough that I could see it from across the street. I tested this by walking out to the sidewalk at midnight. I looked back at my house, at the lantern on the porch. It was clearly glowing. No one else was around. The street was quiet and empty. I hurried back inside, feeling exposed and uneasy. On December 23rd, I tried placing a cloth inside the lantern to block the light. I stuffed a small piece of dark fabric in there before midnight. When midnight came, I stepped outside to watch. The lantern glowed anyway, bright enough to shine through the cloth. The cloth itself looked lit from within. After the glow ended, I removed the cloth and found nothing changed about it. Just a normal piece of fabric. My sleep was bad that week. I felt tense and jumpy. I kept thinking someone would ask me about the strange light, or that I'd wake up to find the lantern broken or removed. But no one mentioned it. No one asked. Maybe nobody noticed. Or maybe they didn't care. I didn't feel like telling anyone. What would I say? On December 24th, Christmas Eve, I stayed up all night, expecting the glow to be stronger or longer. I sat in the living room with the lantern hanging outside. Midnight came. I checked the porch. Nothing. The lantern stayed dark. I waited 20 minutes, then 30. No glow. My shoulders relaxed slightly, but my heart kept pounding. Had it stopped for good? I waited until 2 a.m. Still no glow. I went to bed, tired and confused. Why stop now after growing brighter each night? On December 25th, Christmas Day, I woke up at sunrise. I felt restless and anxious. I went outside to check the lantern. I noticed something on the glass, a faint smudge. I opened the small door and looked inside. There was a thin layer of soot on the glass and the metal walls, as if something had burned inside. There was no smell, no ash, no candle stub, just soot. I touched it with my fingertip. It rubbed off easily, leaving a dark mark on my skin. My stomach twisted. I had no idea what caused that soot. The lantern had always been empty. It never produced any smoke or smell. It never got warm. But now there was soot, as if something had burned or glowed hot inside it. I spent the day feeling uneasy, my thoughts racing. The lantern no longer glowed, but the memory lingered. For weeks it had shone at midnight, growing brighter and lasting longer, until Christmas Eve when it stopped. Now, on Christmas morning, I found soot inside. I scrubbed the lantern clean with a cloth. The soot came off, leaving the glass and metal shiny again. I hung it back up and stepped back, looking at it. It looked normal again, like a simple decorative lantern. But I didn't feel normal. My chest felt tight. My shoulders were stiff. I kept glancing at the lantern as if expecting something else. Over the next few days, I watched it at midnight, but it never glowed again. It stayed dark and cold, just like before December. I never found an explanation. I tried to forget, but at night, when I passed by the porch, I remembered the glow. I remembered how it grew brighter each day, how it ignored my attempts to block it or move it. I remembered the soot inside on Christmas Day. I had no answers. The lantern hung there, silent and empty, as if nothing had happened. Eventually, I stopped checking it at midnight. I tried to convince myself it had been a strange, unexplained event that was now over, but I still felt uneasy. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and think I saw a faint glow outside. I'd get up and look, but the lantern stayed dark. Just my imagination, I guess. Months passed. Everything returned to normal, but I haven't forgotten. The soot inside the lantern proved something had happened, something real. I still feel nervous when I think about it. I don't like standing too close to that lantern. I don't touch it anymore. It's just there, a quiet reminder of those December nights. No one else knows this story. I never told anyone. Who would believe it? I have no proof now. I erased the videos and photos I took, too unsettled by what they showed. The lantern remains, unchanged. I leave it alone, and it leaves me alone. But I remember. Even now, I remember that silent glow. It lasted for most of December and vanished on Christmas. I don't know what it meant. I only know how it felt, unsettling, unexplained, and impossible to ignore while it happened. That's it. That's the whole story. I can't explain it. I can only remember. I first noticed the ice sculptures on December 1st. It was early morning, just after sunrise. I walked into my living room and looked toward the window. I like to open the blinds first thing, to let in some light. That morning, before touching the blinds, I saw something unusual on the windowsill. It was a small figure made of ice, maybe 3 inches tall. It looked like a tiny human shape, but without a face or any clear details. Just the rough outline of a head, body, and limbs. I stood there, rubbing my eyes. I thought maybe the frost on the window had formed an odd shape, but this was no random patch of frost. It was a piece of ice standing upright on the inside windowsill. I ran my finger near it. The surface of the windowsill felt cool, but the room was not freezing. I kept the heating on low at night, but definitely not cold enough to form ice sculptures inside. I leaned in close. The figure was transparent, smooth, and balanced perfectly. It didn't wobble. I touched it lightly with a fingertip. It was solid, definitely ice. I wiped some moisture off my finger. I wondered if some prankster had placed it there. But I lived alone, and my apartment was locked. I shrugged, feeling uneasy. I picked it up carefully and tossed it into the sink. It broke on impact, shattering into a few icy shards. I washed them down the drain. The next morning, December 2nd, I checked the windowsill again as soon as I got up. Another sculpture stood there. It was similar in size and shape, but this time it had thinner arms and a slightly elongated head. Still no features, just a vague humanoid form. My stomach clenched. I checked the window. It was locked. There were no open gaps. The sill was dry except for that small figure. I touched the figure again. Ice, real ice, cold and hard. I looked outside. Snow covered the street, and the air was cold. but inside it was mild. I didn't understand how ice could stay frozen here. The heating system kept my living room around 18 degrees Celsius. That should melt ice fairly quickly, but the figure stood intact. No drips. I got nervous and took another picture with my phone before destroying it again. I crushed it in a paper towel this time, just to be sure it couldn't stand there mocking me. On December 3rd, another figure appeared. This time it had a slight curve to its body, like it was leaning. I realized this was not random. Someone or something was placing these sculptures on my windowsill at night. But how? I decided to stay up late. I turned off most lights and sat in the darkness of my living room facing the window. I waited until midnight, then 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. Nothing happened. I got tired and went to bed around 3 a.m. When I woke up at 7 a.m., a new figure was there. This one was even more delicate, with thin arms and legs and a sort of hump on its back. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was doing this while I slept. By December 5th, the figures had become a daily occurrence. Each morning, I found a new one, slightly different from the last. They were always small, always made of pure, clear ice, and always without faces, just featureless heads. I tried various tactics. I sprinkled salt on the windowsill before going to bed, hoping it would melt any ice placed there. The next morning, the figure stood on top of the salted surface, unmelted. I tried raising the temperature in the room. I set the thermostat higher, hoping the warmer air would prevent ice from staying solid. The next morning's figure was still intact. It did not melt, even at 22 degrees Celsius. This made no sense. Ice should melt at normal room temperature. On December 7th, I covered the windowsill with a thick towel. I thought maybe if the surface wasn't cold, ice couldn't form. I woke up to find the towel pushed aside. A small sculpture stood on the bare sill again. It looked slightly taller than before, with tiny protrusions where I imagined ears might be. I felt a knot in my stomach. This was impossible. Someone had to be entering my home at night. But the door was locked, the windows were locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. I set up a camera on December 8th. I placed my phone on a shelf facing the window and let it record all night. In the morning, I checked the footage. It showed me going to bed around midnight, then hours of darkness and silence. Around 3:30 a.m., there was a slight flicker in the video. When the image stabilized, the sculpture was already there. It just appeared between frames. One frame it wasn't there, the next it was. No figure placing it, no movement. Just a sudden jump in the video. My hands shook as I watched. I felt sweat on my forehead. As the days went by, the sculptures grew more complex. By December 10th, they had thin limbs that looked like fingers or claws. By December 12th, they had more defined shapes to their bodies, suggesting hunched backs, elongated necks, or twisted torsos. They never had faces, but the body shapes became more disturbing. They looked like small creatures rather than simple humanoids. I tried throwing them out as soon as I woke up. I didn't want them lingering there. I felt watched. I started having trouble sleeping, worried about what might appear next. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That ice sculptures were appearing inside my locked apartment at night. They'd think I was crazy. On December 15th, I tried sleeping in the living room. I set my alarm for every hour. Each time it went off, I checked the sill. Nothing appeared while I was awake, but around 4 a.m. I must have dozed off. When I woke up at 6 a.m., a new figure was there, bigger than before, nearly 4 inches tall. Its arms were outstretched, as if reaching for something. My heart pounded. I felt sick. I smashed it and threw the pieces in the sink, then ran hot water until they melted. By December 17th, I considered boarding up the window. But I needed light during the day, and I wasn't even sure it would help. The figures didn't seem to care about barriers. They just appeared. I checked the seal around the window for any hidden cracks. I found none. The apartment above me was empty. I had no neighbors on that side. I was on the second floor. There was no balcony, just a window overlooking a snowy street. I asked a friend to come stay over on December 18th. I didn't tell him exactly what was happening. I just said I was feeling uneasy. He slept in the bedroom while I watched the window. No sculpture appeared while I was awake, but as soon as I left to use the bathroom and returned, there it was again. Another figure, this one with a more twisted torso, almost bending backward. I called my friend over to see it. He looked puzzled. He knew the room was warm, yet the ice figure stood there, not melting at all. He had no explanation. After he left that morning, I sat on the couch, feeling isolated and scared. By December 20th, the sculptures had grown more disturbing. Some had multiple limbs, or lumps that suggested multiple heads. They were still small, but their shapes were unsettling. I started feeling a heavy tension in my chest every night. I dreaded the morning. I knew I would find something new and worse than before. I tried smashing them as soon as they appeared, but that didn't stop the next one from coming. I thought about removing the entire windowsill. It was a wooden sill, and I considered tearing it out with tools. But that was extreme, and I worried it wouldn't stop the sculptures. They might appear on the floor or on a table next. On December 22nd, the figure I found in the morning had a strange, elongated shape. It looked like it was leaning forward, head slightly tilted down. I stared at it for a long time, feeling my skin crawl. I waited to see if it would move, but it never did. It just stood there, silent and solid. On December 23rd, I decided to try a different approach. I placed a thick plastic sheet over the entire window area and taped it down from the inside. I did this before midnight. In the morning, I found the sheet undisturbed, but the sculpture was now sitting in front of the plastic, on top of the tape. It was as if it had bypassed all obstacles. I tore it apart, breathing heavily, feeling angry and helpless. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, I woke up with a tight feeling in my chest, expecting the worst. But when I approached the window, there was nothing. The sill was empty. No sculpture, no ice, just bare wood and the faint warmth of the indoor air. I touched the sill, half expecting to feel something cold. Nothing. I checked repeatedly throughout the morning. Still nothing. Instead of relief, I felt uneasy. Why did it stop now? That night, I stayed in the living room again, watching the window with nervous eyes. I listened to the wind outside. It whistled softly, as if passing through a narrow gap. The room felt strangely quiet and tense, but no figure appeared. On December 25th, Christmas morning, I woke up and checked the window immediately. I found a small puddle of water on the sill. Just a few drops, enough to suggest that something had melted there recently. No figure remained, just that puddle. I wiped it with my fingertip. It was cold water. I looked around, feeling the back of my neck prickle. There was no source for that water. The heating was on, the window locked, everything normal. Yet something had left a final sign, a melted trace. I stood there for a long time, breathing quietly, feeling watched. I could sense that whatever had been placing those sculptures had left now, or maybe it was still around, but no longer showing itself. I felt my heart beating hard. The silence in the apartment felt heavy. Over the following days, no new sculptures appeared. I cleaned the windowsill thoroughly, scrubbing it with hot water and soap. I checked it each morning, half expecting something new, but nothing returned. I never understood what caused those ice sculptures. I never saw who made them or how they appeared. They just started one day in December, grew more disturbing as Christmas approached, and then stopped. The final morning left only a puddle of water, like a last message or a final goodbye. I still live in the same apartment. The window is the same. Everything looks normal now. But I remember how I felt each morning, waking up with dread, knowing I would find another impossible figure of ice. I remember the tension in my muscles, the sweat on my face, the trembling in my hands as I destroyed each sculpture. I remember the odd shapes, the twisted bodies, the silent presence they brought into my home. I keep my curtains drawn at night now. I try not to think about it, but sometimes I catch myself looking at that windowsill, imagining those tiny ice figures standing there, watching me with their blank faces. I wonder if they'll ever come back. For now, they haven't. But I'll never forget the way they made me feel. I first noticed the sound on December 1st. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The house was quiet. It was a small place, just me living there, so I knew most of the familiar noises. The heating would click on and off. Sometimes the pipes would groan softly. None of that bothered me. But that night, I heard something different. It came from outside, from the backyard. A long, soft sound, almost like a sigh. It lasted only a few seconds. I sat up, listened again, but it didn't repeat right away. I told myself it was the wind and went back to sleep. The next night, I heard it again. This time, I was reading a book before bed. The sound came around midnight. A low, soft noise, not quite a whisper, not quite a breath, but something in between. It sounded almost human, but too faint, too airy. I turned off my reading lamp and went to the window. I looked out at my backyard. It was dark except for the faint light from a distant street lamp. In the center of the yard stood an old, leafless tree. It had been there when I moved in, just a tall, dead-looking tree with no leaves. Its branches were thin and dry. I saw nothing moving, no animals, no people. I listened, but the sound didn't repeat. By December 3rd, I started to feel uneasy. Each night, at some point between midnight and 1 in the morning, I heard that soft sighing noise, always coming from the direction of the tree. During the day, I went outside and checked the tree closely. The trunk was dry, the bark cracked. No nests, no visible holes. The ground around it was frozen. I tried shaking one of the lower branches. It creaked like old wood, but no special sound. In daylight, it was just a dead tree. At night, it made that noise. I couldn't explain it. On December 5th, I stayed up late, waiting near the window with the lights off. I wanted to catch the sound at the exact moment. Around 12:30 a.m., I heard it again. A soft, drawn-out sigh. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. I pressed my ear against the cold window pane. The hair on my arms stood up. It sounded so close, but also distant, as if it came from somewhere in the branches. I opened the window a crack, letting the cold air in. I listened for more, but the sound stopped for the night. My sleep got worse as December went on. The anticipation of that strange noise kept me awake. I found myself lying in bed, heart beating faster as midnight approached. Each time I heard that faint sigh, I felt my chest tighten. It was not loud, not threatening, but unsettling. I tried recording it with my phone. I set the phone on the windowsill, hit record, and waited. When I played it back the next morning, I heard only a faint rustle. The sigh didn't come through clearly, just a hint of something, maybe the wind. I felt frustrated and nervous. On December 10th, I decided to go outside at night. I put on a coat, gloves, and boots. Around midnight, I stepped out into the backyard with a flashlight. The air was freezing. My breath came out in white puffs. I approached the tree slowly. My boots crunched the frozen ground. I stood a few feet from the trunk, shining the flashlight upward. The branches cast thin shadows on the snow. I waited. At first I heard nothing but my own breathing and a distant car passing on another street. Then I heard it, closer now because I was outside. A soft exhale of air, like someone sighing in sadness or relief. I froze, shining the flashlight into the branches. Nothing moved. I stepped closer until I could touch the trunk. I leaned my head back, looking up. The sound faded. I felt my legs tense. I realized I didn't want to stay out here. My heart was beating faster. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I couldn't explain why I was so uneasy. The sound was quiet, not a scream or a roar, just a sigh. But it felt wrong. I tried telling myself it was just the wind passing through the dry branches at a certain angle, producing a human-like sound. But I had never heard a tree make a sound like that before. As the days passed, the sound varied slightly in length and volume. Sometimes it lasted only a second, barely a whisper. Other nights it stretched out for several seconds, making my skin crawl. I started dreading midnight. I tried going to bed earlier, hoping to be asleep before the sigh came. But I usually ended up lying there awake, waiting, listening. My stomach would knot up when I heard it. On December 15th, I tried ignoring it. I put on music in my headphones and turned up the volume. At around midnight, I saw the time on my phone and braced myself. Even through the music, I thought I heard a faint sigh. I took off the headphones. The night was quiet. I felt no relief. I knew it was still happening, night after night. By December 18th, I had considered cutting down the tree, but it was tall and thick, and I had no experience with that. Also, it was winter and the ground was hard. Plus, I wasn't even sure the tree was the real cause. It seemed so, but what if the noise was coming from something else near it? Still, I hated that tree now. During the day, I'd stare at it through the window, trying to see if anything changed. It always looked the same, dry branches, no leaves, no sign of life. December 20th came, and I was tired and on edge. I was losing sleep. I tried turning on all the lights in the house at night, as if that could scare away whatever was making the sound. It didn't help. The sigh came anyway. I paced around the living room, feeling angry and helpless. It was just a sound, but it made me feel watched, or maybe not watched, but aware of something I couldn't understand. On December 22nd, the sigh sounded louder than before, or maybe I was just more sensitive to it. I jumped up from my bed and ran to the window, pressing my face against the glass. I whispered, "What do you want?" like an idiot, asking a tree a question. Of course, no answer. Just silence after the sigh faded. My heart pounded, and I felt sweat on my forehead despite the cold. December 23rd was worse. I stayed up until past 1 in the morning, waiting, listening. The sigh came late, around 1:15 a.m., long and low. I clenched my fists, feeling a chill run down my back. I thought about calling someone, maybe a friend, just to talk, to say something strange was happening. But who would believe me? A tree in my backyard sighs at night. They'd laugh or think I was joking. I didn't need ridicule. I needed peace. December 24th, Christmas Eve, arrived. The day passed quietly. I tried to keep busy. I ate dinner, watched TV, tried not to think about the tree. But as night fell, my stomach tightened. I expected the sigh as usual. Midnight came. I sat in the dark, waiting. 5 minutes passed, 10, 20. Nothing. I got up and looked out the window. The tree stood silent and still. I opened the window slightly to listen. Just the faint sound of distant wind. No sigh. I waited over an hour. Still nothing. My shoulders relaxed a bit, but I felt uneasy, like something was off. Why did it stop now? It had been so regular each night. I stayed up until 2 in the morning. No sigh. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep in the armchair near the window. On December 25th, Christmas morning, I woke with a stiff neck and a headache. I looked outside. The tree was still there, silent and dry. No snow had fallen overnight. Everything looked normal, but I felt tense. I got dressed and went outside to check the tree in daylight again. I touched the trunk. It felt rough and dead. No sign of new damage, no fresh cracks, nothing that would explain a noise. I kicked the trunk lightly, just out of frustration. It made a dull thud, that's all. I stood in the backyard, my breath visible in the cold air, remembering all those nights I heard that strange sigh. Now it had stopped, and I didn't know what to feel, relief or confusion. On one hand, the silence was a welcome change. On the other, I had no explanation, and the sudden end was suspicious. I walked back inside and made coffee. The silence of the morning felt heavy. For the rest of December 25th, I kept checking the clock. Each time midnight approached, I braced myself, but there was no sigh. The nights after Christmas remained quiet. The tree never made that sound again. As days turned into weeks, I began to relax a bit. My sleep improved. I started to feel silly for having been so scared of a noise. But the memory stayed with me. I never understood what caused it. I never found a logical explanation. The tree remained in my backyard until spring, when I finally hired someone to remove it. The worker who cut it down said the wood was dry and rotten inside. He found no hollow spaces that might have trapped air. Nothing unusual at all. I still think about those December nights sometimes. The tension in my chest when I heard that sigh, the way it sounded so human, yet came from a dead tree. I remember the sleepless nights, the feeling of dread, and the sudden silence on Christmas Eve, as if the sound had fulfilled whatever purpose it had. I have no evidence of what happened, no recordings that prove it, just my own memory. It's been a while now, and my backyard is empty where the tree once stood. I have new plans for that space, maybe a garden or a small shed, but I still recall the way that sigh made me feel. Even though the tree is gone, the uneasy memory remains. Sometimes late at night, when the house is silent, I strain my ears, expecting to hear something, but I never do. The sigh is gone, leaving me with only questions and a lingering sense of discomfort. That's all there is to tell. I can't add more details. I can't explain it. I can only remember how it felt and how relieved I was when it finally stopped. I try to move on, but I doubt I'll ever forget those nights. I first noticed something strange in my reflection on December 1st. It was late afternoon, getting dark outside. I stood by the living room window, checking if it might snow soon. The street was quiet, and the glass felt cold against my fingertips. I saw my reflection clearly, my face, my shoulders, my old sweater. But just behind my reflection, in the faint light, I thought I saw a shape. It was not my furniture or anything inside the house. It looked like a vague, dark spot floating behind me. I turned around quickly to see if there was something behind me. Nothing. Just the empty room and the lamp on the side table. I pressed my face closer to the glass and looked again. My reflection stared back, and I could see the streetlights turning on outside. The strange shape was gone. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. I decided not to think too hard about it. The next evening, December 2nd, I stood at the same window. I had turned on some holiday lights in the room, a small string of red and green bulbs around the window frame. I looked outside, admiring how the neighborhood had started decorating. Then I saw my reflection again. This time, I spotted that same dark blur, faint but present, hovering behind my reflected head. It didn't match anything in the room. It looked like a patch of shadow clinging to the background of my image. I twisted my neck, trying different angles, but it always stayed behind me in the reflection, not in reality. When I turned around, the room looked normal. My stomach felt tense. I rubbed my eyes and told myself it was a smudge on the glass. I took a cloth and wiped the window. No dirt, no smudge. I looked again. The shape was still there, slightly clearer now, as if outlined by the glow of the holiday lights. I felt a chill on my arms. I closed the curtains and tried to forget about it. Over the next few days, I checked the window only in passing. December 5th, 6th, 7th. Each time I glanced at my reflection in the evening, I saw that vague shape. It was never fully formed, just a dark, uncertain figure behind me. It had no distinct features, no face, no limbs, more like a blurry silhouette that hovered in the background. I couldn't place its exact position. It was always shifting slightly, but never disappearing completely. I started feeling uneasy. I thought maybe someone outside was causing a reflection. But when I looked outside, I saw nothing but the empty street and a few parked cars. No one stood there, no strange objects, just the normal winter scenery. Besides, the shape looked like it was inside the reflection, not outside in the street. By December 10th, the shape had become more noticeable. It seemed to solidify a bit each day. I found myself drawn to the window at dusk, as if I needed to check if it was still there. It always was. I could see my own eyes in the reflection and that dark patch behind me. It made my heart beat faster. I tried ignoring it, but the feeling that something was off kept growing. On December 12th, I tried turning off all the lights inside and looking at my reflection only with the outdoor streetlights. The shape remained, now slightly more distinct. Still no face, no details, just a darker region behind my reflection, like a stain that refused to go away. My hands felt sweaty. I stepped away from the window and took a deep breath. I told myself it was just a weird optical effect. Maybe the double-glazed window had some imperfection. As the days passed, I noticed that the shape appeared mostly in the evenings, when the contrast between the warm indoor lights and the cold outside darkness was strong. By December 15th, I could almost guess the time by the clarity of the shape. Around 5 p.m., when I turned on the indoor lamps and the Christmas lights, the shape would appear stronger. During the day, if I checked the window, I saw only my reflection and the outside world, nothing unusual. This pattern made me more uncomfortable. It felt deliberate, as if something took advantage of the lighting conditions. I started feeling watched. Each time I stood at the window, I felt a tightening in my chest. I began to avoid looking at my reflection. If I needed to look outside, I'd do so from an angle, trying not to see that dark patch lurking behind my own image. On December 18th, after another tense evening of spotting the shape, I tried an experiment. I covered the window with a thick blanket before turning on the lights. I stayed inside with the blanket pinned over the glass so there would be no reflection. I waited a few hours, trying to distract myself with TV. Late at night, before going to bed, I removed the blanket. I looked at my reflection quickly. The shape was still there. Covering the window hadn't changed anything. My heart sank. It meant the shape might not depend on me looking at it. It was there regardless. I started sleeping poorly. I would wake up in the middle of the night and wonder if the shape was still waiting in my reflection. I tried telling a friend about it over the phone, but I ended up sounding unsure and nervous. I described it as a strange blur in my reflection that wouldn't go away. My friend joked about ghosts in the window. I forced a laugh, but inside I felt more anxious. By December 20th, the shape seemed darker and slightly larger. I still couldn't identify any features. It was not a person, not an animal, just a darker form. Sometimes it seemed closer to me in the reflection, sometimes further behind. But it never appeared in real life. If I turned around, the room was empty. It was only in the reflection that it existed. On December 22nd, I spent almost an hour staring at the window, trying to catch any movement in the shape. I stood very still, breathing quietly, my nose almost touching the glass. At times I thought I saw it shift slightly, as if drifting left or right, but I couldn't be sure. My eyes watered from staring. I ended up feeling lightheaded and had to sit down. December 23rd, Christmas Eve, I decided to try something else. I placed a bright lamp right next to the window, shining inward. I thought maybe if I changed the lighting drastically, the shape would vanish. But when I checked my reflection, the shape was still there. The bright lamp washed out some of my own reflection, making it paler, but the dark shape remained behind me, unaffected. I felt my heartbeat in my temples. I realized I was holding my breath. I exhaled slowly, feeling a tremor in my hands. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, I woke up feeling a sense of dread. I knew I would see the shape again, and I didn't know what to do about it. In the afternoon, I tried taping a cardboard sheet over the glass. I left it there all day and evening, trying to avoid even looking at the window. I thought that maybe if I didn't look, it wouldn't affect me. But as the evening wore on, I felt more and more tense. The presence of that shape, or at least the memory of it, weighed on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was behind the cardboard, still reflected somehow. Around midnight, just before Christmas Day, I removed the cardboard. I had to know if it was still there. I turned on the overhead light and stepped in front of the window. My reflection came into view, and behind me, the shape still hovered, dark and silent. I felt my chest tighten. I tried covering my face with my hand and peeking around it. The shape stayed in place, independent of my movements. I spoke out loud, a soft whisper. "What do you want?" I heard my own voice, slightly shaky. Of course, no answer. Just my own eyes staring back, and that shadowy presence behind me. I tried stepping back quickly, seeing if it would react. No change. I turned off the light in the room, leaving only the faint glow of a street lamp outside. The shape still clung to my reflection, a dark blot in the glass. My throat felt dry. I went to bed, leaving the room in darkness. I tried to sleep, but I kept seeing that shape in my mind. It was as if it were pressed against the window, watching me from inside the reflection. On December 25th, Christmas morning, I got up feeling drained. I hadn't slept well. I hesitated before going to the window. Eventually, I forced myself to check. I needed to know if the shape was still there. I approached the window slowly. The sun was up, bright winter light flooding the street. I looked at the glass. My reflection stared back, just a normal reflection this time. No dark shape hovered behind me, just the background of my living room. I turned the lights on and off, trying different angles. Nothing. The shape was gone. It was completely back to normal. I stood there for a long time, staring at the normal reflection, feeling relief and confusion. Why had it disappeared now, on Christmas morning? I tried to find any reason. I touched the glass, felt the cold surface under my fingertips. I saw only my own face, the furniture behind me, the wall, all as it should be. No strange shadows, no vague outlines. Everything was clear and ordinary. My body relaxed a little, my shoulders dropped. I realized how tense I had been for weeks. I smiled weakly, relieved that it was over. I spent the morning tidying the house, making coffee, trying to pretend it never happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The memory of that dark shape behind my reflection lingered in my mind. Even though it was gone, I kept remembering the feeling of being watched by something I couldn't identify. As the day went on, I checked the window several times just to be sure. Each time, my reflection was perfectly normal. No odd shapes, no shadows. I started to relax more, telling myself it must have been some strange trick of light and timing, or maybe my imagination enhanced by the holiday stress. Still, my gut told me it was real. I had seen it so many times, and it never left until now. In the following days, the window remained normal. I never saw that shape again, but I never fully shook off the discomfort it caused me. Sometimes, late at night, when I catch my reflection in a dark screen or a piece of glass, I flinch for a second, half expecting to see that dark shape again. It doesn't return, but the memory is enough to make my heart beat faster. I live with that memory now. The reflection that showed something behind me, something not quite real and not quite imaginary, something I couldn't explain. It never harmed me, never moved, never made a sound. But the feeling of being observed, even if only through my own reflection, was unsettling. It ended on Christmas Day, leaving me with normal reflections and an uneasy recollection. I have no answers, no proof, just my own experience. The window and my reflection look normal now, but the thought of that shape still makes me feel uneasy. I try not to think about it too much. It's over, and that should be enough. But deep down, I know I'll never forget how it felt to see that shape behind me, watching silently from within the glass. I noticed the sound for the first time on December 1st, around 2 in the morning. I had gotten up to use the bathroom and was returning to bed when I heard something faint coming from the living room. My house was silent except for that sound. It was a soft, whispering noise, almost too quiet to pick up at first. I stood near the couch, listening. It came from the direction of the old fireplace. I moved closer to the chimney. I hadn't used it in years. The flue was closed. I kept it shut because I never made fires there, and I didn't want cold drafts. I pressed my ear against the brick. The whisper was still there. It sounded like someone whispering very low, just on the edge of hearing. I strained to catch a word, but there was nothing I could understand. It felt more like a pattern of soft breaths than actual words. I looked around the room, making sure no windows were open. Everything was closed tight. The heating system hummed quietly, nothing else. I eventually went back to bed, unsure what to think. The next night, December 2nd, I stayed awake until the same hour. I turned off the TV and all the lights and sat in the dark living room, facing the fireplace. I waited, leaning forward on the couch, my elbows on my knees. After about an hour, I heard it again. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from inside the chimney. I moved closer, standing right in front of the brick opening. The sound was steady, soft, and rhythmic. It didn't match the usual creaks of an old house or the distant hum of appliances. It had a certain cadence, like a slow murmur. I tried tapping on the brick, hoping to see if it would stop or change. It didn't. The whisper continued at its own pace. I whispered, "Hello?" softly, feeling a bit foolish. No response. The sound didn't react to me at all. After a while I gave up and went to bed, feeling uneasy. I told myself it was probably just a weird draft or some odd acoustic effect. By December 5th, the whispering had become a nightly thing. I noticed it started roughly after midnight and continued for an hour or two. Always the same soft, distant sound. I tried different approaches. I opened a window slightly to see if the noise changed. It didn't. I tapped the outside of the chimney from the garden. No difference. I shone a flashlight up inside the chimney. Just a closed flue and some old soot. Nothing unusual. I considered the possibility of an animal nesting in there. Maybe a small bird or rodent making a strange noise. But it really sounded like whispering, not scratching or squeaking. I never heard movement. The sound had a breathy quality that unsettled me. On December 7th, I recorded it with my phone. I held the phone near the chimney and pressed record for a few minutes. In the morning, I played it back. The recording caught a faint noise, but it sounded more like static than a voice. I couldn't prove to anyone that it sounded like whispering. It was too subtle. By December 10th, I was losing sleep. Each night I felt compelled to listen, to try to understand the whisper. It started to feel like the sound had a pattern, not words, but a rise and fall, a kind of rhythm. I tried to mimic it in my head, but I failed to find meaning. It made my stomach feel tight. My arms got goosebumps each time I leaned in to listen. I told a friend about it on the phone. He laughed and said it must be the wind or some pipe noise. I wanted to believe that, but deep down I knew it wasn't normal. I knew the difference between wind rattling and a voice-like whisper. This was more deliberate, more alive somehow. As the days passed, the whispering seemed to change slightly. By December 15th, I noticed it had become slower, more drawn out. The pauses between the soft murmurs grew longer. Instead of a steady hush, hush, hush pattern, it was now a slower, elongated hush. Hush, hush. I leaned on the mantel, my heart pounding, trying to guess why it changed. Was it reacting to something? Or was it following some unknown cycle? I tried opening the flue on December 16th. Maybe I could see something inside. I pulled the lever and shone a flashlight upward. The chimney shaft looked old and dusty, but empty. No nests, no debris that I could see. Just dark bricks and a narrow channel leading to the outside. I heard the whisper as I looked up. It echoed slightly in the shaft, giving me chills. I closed the flue again. I didn't want to leave it open. On December 18th, I found myself talking to the chimney. I felt ridiculous, but I was desperate for any response. I asked, "Who's there?" Quietly. I asked if it needed help. I asked if it could speak louder. I got no reply. The whisper continued at its own pace, ignoring me completely. I felt frustrated and a bit scared. The sound was too human to be comforting, but not human enough to be understood. By December 20th, the whispering got even slower and more drawn out. It sounded like long exhalations of breath with tiny breaks in between. If I focused hard, I almost imagined faint syllables, but they never formed real words. My heart would race each time I tried to decode it. I stayed up longer each night, barely getting any real sleep. During the day, I was tired and irritable. I wanted this to stop, but I also felt compelled to keep listening, as if I might crack the mystery if I just tried hard enough. On December 22nd, I considered calling a chimney sweep to inspect it. But what would I say? I hear whispering in my chimney at night? They'd think I was nuts. Also, it was almost Christmas. It would be hard to get someone to come out on short notice. I decided to wait a bit more. Maybe it would go away on its own after the holidays. December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, The whispering was now very slow and spaced out. It was like one long whisper every 30 seconds or so. Each whisper sent a shiver down my spine. I pressed my ear against the brick and listened, eyes closed. I could feel my breathing speeding up each time the whisper came. It sounded almost tired, as if the source was losing strength. December 24th, Christmas Eve. I sat in the dark living room, listening again. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning, then 2. At some point I realized I hadn't heard the whisper. I leaned in closer. Nothing. No sound at all. I waited for hours, expecting it to start again. It never did. I felt my chest tighten. The silence felt even worse than the whisper. Where did it go? Why did it stop now? I stayed up almost until dawn, staring at the fireplace, feeling uneasy. The absence of the whisper made me wonder if I had imagined it all, but I knew I hadn't. I had heard it night after night. Now, on Christmas Eve, it vanished without explanation. I finally went to bed, exhausted and unsettled. On December 25th, Christmas Day, I woke up late. I made coffee and tried to relax. The morning light filled the house. Everything seemed normal. I walked over to the chimney and looked inside one more time. It was cold and empty. I ran my finger along the inside edge. The bricks were dusty. No fresh soot, nothing new, just the old, unused fireplace I had known for years. I turned on some music, trying to enjoy the holiday, but my mind kept going back to the whisper. I wondered if I should open the flue and check again. I pulled the lever and peered up with a flashlight. The chimney looked the same as always, no traces of anything unusual. I listened closely. No sound at all, just the distant noise of cars outside and my own breathing. I spent the afternoon trying not to think about it. I told myself it was over. Whatever caused that whispering had stopped, but the memory didn't fade. I replayed the sounds in my head. I tried to remember if there had been any pattern or message. Nothing clear came to mind. It was just an uneasy, rhythmic whisper that had grown slower as Christmas approached. I thought about calling that friend again, but what would I say now? It stopped. That's all. It wouldn't help me understand what happened. I decided to keep it to myself. Maybe I would never know the truth. In the following nights, I checked the chimney out of habit. No whisper returned. The silence was complete. The house felt normal again, but I didn't feel relieved. Instead, I felt a lingering discomfort. I knew what I had heard. Even if it made no sense, it had been there, haunting my nights. Now it was gone, leaving no evidence, no explanation. I tried reasoning it out. If it was wind, why did it sound so rhythmic and voice-like? If it was an animal, why no other signs of presence? If it was some acoustic quirk of pipes or ducks, why did it stop abruptly on Christmas Eve? Nothing fit neatly. Days turned into a week, and I still thought about it. The fear had faded, replaced by a stubborn curiosity. Sometimes I stood by the fireplace in the afternoon, just looking at it. The bricks were old and rough to the touch. I ran my hand over them, remembering how I used to want to fix up this old chimney. I never got around to it. Now I felt reluctant to change anything, as if the chimney held a secret I shouldn't disturb. I told myself to move on. It was just a strange event that happened in December. Maybe it was tied to the cold weather or some temporary draft pattern. Maybe something in the chimney had shifted and then returned to normal. I tried to convince myself that was enough of an explanation. But late at night, when the house is very quiet, I sometimes find myself listening for that whisper. I know it's not there, but I can't help straining my ears, half expecting to hear that soft, distant murmur again. My heartbeat speeds up just thinking about it. I still remember how my skin felt each time I leaned close, waiting for the next whisper, hoping to catch a hint of meaning. It left me with questions I can't answer. The chimney is still unused, just part of the house's structure. The flue stays closed. I have no reason to open it now. Everything looks normal. But I can't forget those December nights. The whispering started for no clear reason and ended just as mysteriously. I live here alone, and I try to keep a routine. I sleep better now that the sound is gone, but I miss the mystery in a way, even though it scared me. At least it was something unusual, something that made me pay attention. Now I have only silence and uncertainty. In the end, I have no conclusion. I can only say what happened. For most of December, I heard a faint whispering sound inside my unused chimney every night, growing slower and more drawn out as Christmas approached. On Christmas Eve, it disappeared suddenly. On Christmas Day, there was no trace of anything inside. The sound never came back. I'm left with the memory and a lingering sense of unease that I can't shake off. That's all I know. I experienced it, I listened to it, and then it ended. I don't have a neat explanation, and I probably never will. For now, I accept that the chimney is silent again and try to move on with my life, carrying that unsettling memory with me. I first noticed the marks on December 1st early in the morning. I had just woken up and walked into the living room. The room was quiet, and the winter light came in through the windows, pale and weak. As I stepped onto the carpet in front of the couch, I saw strange imprints on the fibers. They looked like faint depressions, as if someone had pressed fingertips into the soft surface. They formed a small cluster near the center of the carpet. I knelt down and touched them. The carpet felt normal, not damp or stiff. The marks didn't rub away easily. They stayed visible, catching the light at a different angle than the rest of the fibers. I shrugged, thinking maybe I had stepped strangely the night before, or maybe I had dropped something. I didn't pay much attention. I moved on with my day. The next morning, December 2nd, I found more marks. This time, they were in a slightly different area of the carpet. They formed a vague line, about a foot long, like a row of small indentations. I got down on all fours to examine them. Each mark looked like a small pressed spot, as if an invisible fingertip or narrow object had poked the carpet fibers down. I tried rubbing my hand over them. They stayed visible. I tried pressing my own fingertip into the carpet to see if I could reproduce the mark. My own pressure left a faint imprint, but it disappeared quickly when I fluffed the fibers. The mysterious marks did not fluff back up. They stayed flattened. This made my chest tighten a bit. I frowned, feeling a slight discomfort. I lived alone. No one else had access to my house at night. I locked all doors and windows. There were no pets. The heating system ran quietly. I saw no reason for these marks to appear, but I tried not to worry. Maybe it was just some quirk of the carpet or something settling under the floor. By December 5th, the marks had appeared every morning. Each day I found new patterns. Sometimes they were just clusters, sometimes lines, sometimes small arcs. They never looked random. They formed shapes that I couldn't identify. They didn't look like letters or symbols I recognized, but they seemed deliberate. I started feeling tense each time I woke up. I would walk into the living room slowly, heart beating a bit faster, and look down at the carpet. Always new marks, always silent and strange. I tried vacuuming the carpet thoroughly on December 6th, hoping to restore the fibers. The vacuum lifted some marks, but not all. The deeper ones remained visible. The next morning, new marks appeared right next to the old ones. Now I had multiple sets of these indentations forming an odd pattern across the center of the carpet. I felt my stomach knot. My arms got goosebumps. I tried to ignore the feeling and focus on normal tasks, but it bothered me all day. On December 8th, I decided to stay awake and watch the carpet overnight. I turned off most lights and sat in the dark, facing the living room. I drank coffee to stay alert. I watched the carpet for hours. Nothing happened while I was awake. No movement, no sound. Around 3 in the morning, I grew tired. My eyes felt heavy. I must have dozed off at some point. When I woke up at dawn, I looked down. New marks had appeared again, different from the previous night. Somehow, they only formed while I slept, never when I watched. This frustrated and scared me. How could something make these marks without a sound, without waking me? I thought about setting up a camera, but I didn't own one. I tried using my phone's camera on December 10th, leaving it recording all night, plugged into the wall. In the morning, I checked the footage. The video ran for hours, showing the dark living room. I scrubbed through the timeline. Nothing moved. No one entered the room. Yet the marks were there again, new and fresh. The camera showed the carpet looking normal one moment, and then, a few frames later, the marks existed. There was no visible transition. It was as if they just appeared between frames, too fast or too subtle to catch. My heart pounded as I watched this footage. My hands felt clammy. I realized that this was not something I could easily explain. I had proof that the marks appeared without visible cause. I felt a chill on my neck. I couldn't understand how this was possible. By December 12th, the patterns grew more complex. The marks formed shapes that looked almost geometric. Lines intersected at slight angles. Some indentations formed small curves that repeated every few inches. I stood over them, studying the patterns, trying to guess if they meant something. They didn't look like any writing system I knew. They also didn't look like random scribbles. They had too much structure, too many repetitions. I started feeling deeply uneasy. My chest felt tight, and I had trouble sleeping. Even when I tried staying awake all night, I eventually nodded off, and the marks reappeared. On December 15th, I tried placing heavy objects on the carpet overnight. I moved the coffee table, a chair, and a stack of books to cover the central area where the marks usually appeared. In the morning, I found the objects slightly shifted, just an inch or two, and new marks appeared in the uncovered sections. The marks avoided the objects as if they knew where I had placed them. This sent a jolt of fear through me. Something invisible seemed to be interacting with the environment. It didn't move the objects far, but enough to form new marks elsewhere. I started feeling watched. During the day, I kept glancing at the carpet, expecting to see it change before my eyes. It never did. Only overnight. I felt my heartbeat speed up each evening as bedtime approached. I tried sleeping in another room, but it made no difference. The marks still appeared in the living room. By December 18th, the patterns formed something intricate. The marks now covered a large portion of the carpet. They formed a swirling design that radiated from the center, with lines and curves branching out. It looked almost symmetrical. I tried photographing it with my phone and comparing the images day to day. I saw that each morning's new marks added to a growing, layered pattern. It was as if something was building a complex design step by step. I felt shaky and anxious. I barely slept. I tried calling a friend to talk about it, but what would I say? My carpet grows strange marks overnight by itself. They'd think I was joking or losing my mind. I checked the carpet backing, looking for some mechanical cause. I lifted a corner and looked underneath, expecting to see damage or some kind of mechanism. Nothing, just the wooden floorboards, solid and plain. December 20th, the pattern was nearly complete. I could see that it formed a large, intricate shape, like a circular symbol with radiating lines. The marks were so detailed now. Some indentations were small and clustered, others stretched in neat rows. I knelt down and ran my fingertips over them. They felt smooth but pressed down firmly. I could not fluff them up or erase them. It was as if the carpet fibers had been reshaped at a microscopic level. My shoulders tensed. I realized that in a few days it would be Christmas, and I had no idea what would happen then. On December 22nd, the pattern reached a peak of complexity. The entire center of the carpet was covered with a design that looked almost too perfect. Even though I avoided artistic interpretations, I couldn't help feeling that this was a deliberate symbol. My breathing got shallow. I felt lightheaded. I hated how helpless I felt. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't catch it in the act. I could only watch as it evolved each morning. December 23rd, I woke up early and rushed to the living room. The pattern was slightly changed again, more refined. The marks formed a complete symmetrical shape now. There were no random clusters, only a smooth, organized design. I stood there, shaking my head, feeling goosebumps on my arms. I checked the doors and windows again. Locked, no footprints, no signs of intrusion, nothing. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, I woke with dread in my chest. I walked slowly into the living room, expecting some final, terrifying pattern. Instead, I found the carpet completely normal. No new marks. In fact, all the old marks were gone. The entire surface looked fresh and untouched, as if brand new. I dropped to my knees and felt the fibers. They were soft and even, no indentations at all. I blinked, shocked. After weeks of strange marks building up into a complex pattern, they vanished overnight. I didn't know how to feel. Relief, confusion, fear, all of them at once. My heart raced. I tried to make sense of it. The marks had grown each day, forming something intricate, and now, on Christmas Eve, they disappeared without a trace. The carpet looked perfect again. I touched every spot, searching for any leftover indentation. Nothing. It was as if someone had erased it perfectly. I spent the day unsettled. I kept checking the carpet, half expecting the marks to return at any moment. They did not. I tried to relax, telling myself it was over. But I couldn't shake the tension. My stomach felt tight. My shoulders ached from stress. I went to bed late, feeling uneasy but exhausted. On December 25th, Christmas Day, I woke up and immediately went to the living room. The carpet was still normal, no marks. I let out a sigh and reached down to touch it again, just to be sure. As my hand pressed into the fibers, I felt a sudden chill run through my arm. A cold sensation, like touching ice-cold metal. I pulled my hand back, startled. I touched the carpet again, slower. It felt normal in texture, but I got that same uneasy feeling, like a mild electric current or a subtle coldness. Not painful, just unsettling. I stood up and backed away. My heart thumped. Something remained in that carpet, something invisible. No marks showed now, but my body reacted to it. I felt sweat on my forehead. I decided to ignore it. I left the room, trying to pretend it never happened. The memory of the patterns, the nights of fear, and the sudden disappearance lingered in my mind. I didn't know what caused it, and I had no explanation. Over the next days, no new marks appeared. The carpet stayed normal in appearance, but each time I walked over it, I felt a slight chill under my feet, a barely perceptible sensation. It might have been my imagination, or maybe a leftover effect of whatever happened in December. I never solved the mystery. I never told anyone. I was afraid they'd laugh or think I was crazy. I have no proof except the photos on my phone, which show some patterns but not clearly enough to convince anyone. The video footage just shows nothing happening visually. Still, I know what I saw and felt. Now, months later, I live with the memory. The carpet looks fine. Guests come over and never notice anything strange. But I remember every morning, the silent growth of those patterns, the tension in my chest, the failed attempts to catch it in the act. I remember how they vanished on Christmas Eve, leaving no trace but a lingering discomfort. I move forward, but the experience changed how I look at my surroundings. I know that something impossible happened in my home, leaving me confused and frightened. I can do nothing but accept it and hope it never returns. Each time I pass over that spot on the carpet, I feel a quiet unease. I think that's all I can do. Live with it. I remember that night well. It was Christmas Eve, and everything around the house felt quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. The street was empty. The neighboring houses had no lights on, and the snow in my small yard reflected the moonlight. It looked almost too bright, but I didn't think much of it at first. I just noticed the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It felt like something waiting. I closed the door, turned off the porch light, and tried to settle inside. I was alone. My family was traveling, and I had decided to stay home for work reasons. I kept my curtains drawn. I left only the Christmas tree lights on in the living room and a single lamp near the couch. There was a sense of routine. Sit on the couch, watch some old holiday special on TV, maybe have a drink or two, and go to sleep. I tried to relax. It started around 10 at night. I heard bells outside, very light, like small handbells or tiny metal chimes. At first, I assumed it was the TV, some sound effect from the show I had on. But when I muted the TV, I realized the sound came from outside. I got up, walked to the window near the front door, and listened carefully. The bells were soft and slow. They sounded close, maybe right at the edge of the yard. I didn't see anyone out there. The street was empty, the snow untouched except for my own footprints from earlier in the day. It was late, and most of the neighbors had turned in. It was cold enough to make going outside a chore. I tried to ignore it. I sat back down and turned the TV volume up just a little, but the bells didn't stop. Every few seconds, a gentle ring. It wasn't a pattern I recognized. It was just a slow, steady ringing. Maybe it was a wind chime somewhere, but no one had wind chimes around here. The wind was weak that night, barely more than a breeze. I decided to wait it out, but as I tried to focus on the TV, I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like I was expecting something bad to happen. I couldn't relax. After a few minutes, I paused the show and walked into the kitchen. I looked out the back window that faced a small fenced area and the shed. Nothing. Snow was piled against the fence. No footprints, no lights. Just that ringing sound, now a bit clearer. It seemed to be coming from the front of the house. I moved back to the living room. I shut off the TV completely to hear better. The bells were there, maybe closer. The sound was outside my windows. I stepped toward the front window, parted the curtain a tiny bit, and looked out. The street light at the corner cast a weak glow over the snow. I saw no one. The snow was smooth except for a single line of footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone out since the afternoon, and I knew exactly where my footsteps had been. These footprints were fresh. They curved around the side of the house, disappearing toward the back. Whoever made them was barefoot or wearing something soft. It was hard to tell. They looked odd, small, and narrow. I listened, pressing my ear against the window. The bells were there, steady, quiet. I decided to act. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I wasn't going to call the cops over some bells, but I needed to understand what was happening. I put on my jacket, boots, and gloves. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The cold air hit my face. The snow was thick, up to my ankles, and every step made a crunching sound. I scanned the street. Nothing moved. The bells were still ringing, but I couldn't see the source. I turned to my left and followed the footprints. They led around the side of the house, near the living room windows. I was careful and quiet, but the snow gave me away with each step. My breath felt too loud in my ears. I shone the flashlight on the footprints. They looked strange. They started suddenly in the middle of the yard, as if someone had dropped out of the sky and begun walking. There was no starting point from the sidewalk or the street. They just began right there in the snow, continuing around toward the back. I followed them slowly, shining my flashlight ahead. The bells were still ringing, always at the same volume. They didn't get louder or softer. I felt like I was walking in circles. The footprints indeed circled the house, passing under the back window, coming around the other side, and eventually leading back toward the front, as if someone had walked around my house several times, but I never saw anyone. I paused near the back window. Nothing was there. No one hid behind the shed. No one crouched under the porch. The neighbors' lights were all off. I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. At some point, the sound of the bells started to bother me on a deeper level. It wasn't just strange. It felt invasive. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. I followed the footprints all the way around, returning to my front yard. They looped around, but never led away. They all vanished in the same spot where they began. I stood there, shining my flashlight on the snow, trying to figure out what was happening. Then I looked at my own windows and saw something that made me stop breathing for a second. My Christmas tree lights were flickering. They had been steady before. They weren't cheap lights, and they didn't have a flicker mode. They were supposed to stay on solid green and red. Now they were blinking in irregular patterns. I could see them through the window, flashing like they were short-circuiting. The bells sounded in my ears. I felt a rush of heat in my cheeks despite the cold. My heart pounded. I wanted to get back inside, but I also wanted to see if something was at the window. I aimed the flashlight at the window, expecting to see a face. I saw nothing, just the reflection of my own flashlight beam. I stepped closer, trying not to slip on the snow. I pressed my face to the glass, cupping a hand to block the glare. Inside, the living room looked normal except for the flickering lights. No one was inside. The front door was still closed. I had locked it behind me, but I still felt unsafe. I realized how tense my muscles were. My shoulders ached. I gave up on finding anyone outside. There was no point wandering around in the freezing cold. I stomped the snow off my boots, stepped back onto the porch, and went inside. Once in, I locked the door and checked all the windows. They were locked. I turned off the Christmas tree lights and turned them on again, hoping to reset them. They still flickered. I pulled the plug from the wall. That stopped the flickering. The bells continued. They were still audible, right outside the window, I thought. I stood by the window, listening. The bells started to slow down. Instead of a steady ring, they rang every few seconds, softer and softer. I waited, holding my breath. After about a minute, I heard nothing. I waited longer. Still nothing. The silence came back, and with it, a feeling of dread. I felt like whoever or whatever had been outside was now even closer. I moved to the kitchen and grabbed a kitchen knife. I wasn't proud of holding a knife in my own home on Christmas Eve, but I didn't feel safe. I checked every room in the house: bedroom, bathroom, closets, under the bed. Everything was empty and still. The only sound was my breathing and the hum of the refrigerator. I looked at the digital clock on the microwave. Almost midnight. I had no idea what to do. Calling the police felt ridiculous. What would I say? That I heard bells and saw footprints, but no one was there. They would think I was imagining things. I just wanted to get through the night. Maybe it was some prank. Maybe kids messing around. But the footprints had no clear start or end, and that bothered me. I decided to stay awake. I turned on a few more lights, checked the thermostat, and sat in my armchair with the knife nearby. I listened for any sound. The silence was thick. The temperature felt odd. Even though the heater was on, I felt cold. My hands shook a bit. I tried to breathe slowly, calm down. The night dragged. Every small noise, house settling, pipes ticking, made me jump. I got up and looked outside a few times. The footprints were still there. No new ones. No movement. The bells didn't return. Around 2 a.m, I started to relax. Nothing more had happened. The snow kept falling lightly. The street looked peaceful again. No one was out. I considered going to bed. I was tired, but the idea of sleeping felt risky. I kept thinking about the flickering lights and the bells. I remembered how the bells had seemed to circle the house. I had followed those footprints all the way around. They were perfect circles, like someone pacing around my home. The memory made me shiver. I turned on the TV at low volume, something neutral, just to break the silence. I watched old reruns, keeping the volume barely audible. I sat close to the window, looking outside from time to time. At some point, I must have drifted off for a minute or two, because I jerked awake when I thought I heard the bells again. But when I opened my eyes, I realized it was nothing. No sound, just my imagination. The TV showed some holiday commercial. I rubbed my eyes and stood up. The rest of the night passed without incident. I paced the hallway a few times. I drank a glass of water. I went into the bedroom and looked at the alarm clock, 4:30 in the morning, still dark. I decided to lie down on the bed for a while, just to rest my legs. I kept my shoes on, which felt stupid, but I needed to be ready to jump up if something happened. The heater kicked in, and I listened to it humming. I counted the seconds, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, the sky started to lighten. It was around 6 or so when I got back up and walked into the living room. The snow outside looked clean and pale. The footprints were still visible, but slightly covered by fresh snow. No one had come back. I looked closely at them now with the morning light. They were not shaped like normal footprints. They were uniform, almost too perfect, like someone had pressed a template into the snow. But I wasn't sure. Maybe I was seeing things because I was tired. I rubbed my hands over my face. I realized the bells had stopped for good. There was no more ringing. The house was quiet. The Christmas tree, now turned off, stood in the corner. I plugged the lights back in just to see. They lit up normally this time, no flickering. They were steady and calm, brightening the room. It felt stupid, but I was relieved. I took a deep breath. I looked out the window again. The neighboring houses were starting to show signs of life. A light in a window, a silhouette in a kitchen. Cars might start moving soon. The normal world was returning. I opened the front door and stepped out into the cold morning air. The footprints had faded a bit. I could still see them, but in a few hours they would be gone. I looked around carefully. Nothing. No bells, no people, no strange noises. Just a normal street on Christmas morning. I felt a strange knot in my stomach. I knew what I had seen and heard, but now, in the daylight, it felt distant. I stood there for a minute, then went back inside and locked the door. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning up. I made coffee. I turned on the radio to a news station. Nothing unusual reported, just regular holiday chatter. I stood in the living room staring at the window. The feeling of being watched stuck with me. I couldn't shake it. It sat at the back of my mind. I knew I had heard those bells, had seen those footprints, and had watched the lights flicker. But I had no explanation. I checked the security camera feed from the front porch camera, but it had only recorded silence and a slightly fuzzy image of the yard. No one showed up. No figure, no movement. I turned it off and drank my coffee. I knew I would remember this night. It had scared me, though I hadn't seen any real danger. Yet the feeling of tension, the slow ringing of the bells, and those impossible footprints had felt real. I had no answers. I just knew what I had experienced. By midday, the snow was heavier, covering everything, wiping away all traces of footprints. The world moved on. I didn't tell anyone about it. It felt too weird. I went through the day feeling uneasy. I jumped at small sounds. The heater's click startled me. The phone ringing made me flinch. But nothing else happened. No more bells, no strange signs. That night, I kept the curtains closed and went to bed early. I dreamed of the bells, but when I woke, they were gone. Life continued. Even now I remember that Christmas Eve and how quiet the world felt outside. I remember the subtle sound of those bells drifting closer, as if someone stood just beyond my sight. I remember looking out and seeing only footprints in fresh snow. I remember the tree lights flickering and how I stood outside with a flashlight, knife in my hand inside the house, feeling silly and scared. By morning, it was over. Nothing left behind, just my own memory and the lingering sensation that I hadn't been alone. I remember that night. It was late December, a few days before Christmas. The air was cold and damp. A low fog covered my backyard. The grass, the fence, and the small bushes were all half hidden behind a thin white layer of mist. The temperature was low enough that my breath showed in front of my face whenever I stepped outside. I was alone in the house. It was about 9 at night. I had come home from work not long before and was getting ready to settle in. I had a few small Christmas decorations in the living room and a string of lights around the porch. Nothing fancy. I had not bothered with big displays this year. I felt tired most evenings and just wanted quiet time. My house was modest, one story, and the backyard was small. A wooden fence ran around the property. There were no tall trees, just a few shrubs and a single evergreen in the corner. I remember noticing something odd when I looked out the window above the kitchen sink. I had gone there to rinse a glass. My kitchen window faced the backyard. I saw a small light. It was low to the ground, near one of the shrubs. It looked like a Christmas light, a tiny bulb blinking on and off in a steady rhythm. I had red and green lights on the front porch, but nothing in the backyard. I had not hung any lights there. I was sure of that. Yet this single bulb blinked in a slow, even pattern, on for a second, off for a second, and so on. I frowned and leaned closer to the window. The bulb was small and bright, maybe red or green, hard to tell through the fog and the glass. My house lights were on inside, which created glare. I turned off the kitchen light to see better. The bulb was green, I think. It blinked at the same pace. The shrub was bare except for a few dead leaves. I did not remember placing a light there. I lived alone. I had no roommate or family there. I kept my backyard locked. I also knew my neighbors. They never came into my yard uninvited. I dried my hands, turned off the faucet, and stood there watching the light. My heart beat a little faster. There was no wind. The night was quiet. I only heard the distant hum of a neighbor's heating system. Everything else was silent. The fog made the yard feel smaller. I could see my fence, the ground, the shrub. Nothing else, just that single blinking bulb. I decided to go to the living room and check the lights there. My living room was to the side of the house, but I had a window that also looked partially into the backyard if I leaned over. I flipped the switch for the living room lamps. The ceiling light flickered for a moment before turning on. That was unusual. These lights were new and they never flickered before. I checked the other lamps. They seemed fine, but I noticed a slight dimming as if the power was unstable. I went to the back door. It had a small window too. I unlocked it, but did not open it. I stood close, looking through the glass. The backyard looked the same. The single Christmas light blinked steadily. I touched the doorknob. It was cold. I had a sudden urge to open the door and remove that stupid thing from my bush. But before I did, I wanted to see if it reacted to me. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead gently against the glass. As soon as I did, the light started blinking faster. It went from a slow, steady blink to a rapid flicker. That made me jump back. I stepped away from the door. My heart pounded harder. I rubbed my arms. I took a deep breath. Then I moved close to the glass again, but not touching it. The light stayed at its faster pace. I stepped back several paces, and it slowed down again. This was strange. It reacted to my proximity. I repeated this experiment twice, stepping closer and then backing off. Each time I got near the door or the window, the blinking sped up. When I moved away, it slowed down. I had no explanation. Maybe it was some kind of motion sensor light. But why would it be in my bush? I never put anything like that outside. I stood in the hallway for a while trying to think. I felt uneasy. My palms were sweaty. My mouth felt dry. There was no reason for anyone to place a single Christmas light in my backyard. If it was a prank, it was a strange one. I decided I needed to deal with it directly. I would go outside and remove it. I opened the closet near the door and put on a jacket. I put on boots. I turned on the porch light for the backyard. That light flickered too, which made me uncomfortable. It should have turned on steadily, but it flashed a few times before staying lit. I unlocked the back door and opened it slowly. A wave of cold air hit my face. I felt the moisture in the air cling to my skin. I stepped outside, holding a small flashlight. I could see my breath in the light of the porch lamp. I moved toward the shrub. The ground was damp and the grass felt icy. I walked slowly, trying not to make noise. My heart beat fast. I could hear it in my ears. The blinking light was still there, steady now. It had returned to its original pace when I stepped out. I wondered if it could sense me better through the door. As I got closer, I noticed something else. The house lights behind me flickered again. I glanced back. The light shining through the kitchen window dimmed and brightened. I turned forward again and kept walking. I reached the shrub. The small bulb was tucked between a few twigs. It looked like a regular Christmas light bulb, the kind that comes on a string. But there was no string, just a single bulb and a short piece of wire. I bent down, careful not to touch it immediately. I wanted to see if it was connected to something else. I shone my flashlight around the base of the bush. The ground was wet and muddy in spots. Nothing unusual, no footprints, no cords, nothing. The bulb blinked every second. I felt a growing sense of being watched. The back of my neck tingled. The hair on my arms stood up. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching from the fence. I saw nothing, just the fog and the fence. No movement. I took a breath and reached out slowly. I grabbed the bulb. It was cold, but not icy. It felt like plastic. I tried to pull it out. It did not come free easily. I tugged it again. My hand trembled. Suddenly I heard a faint creaking sound. It came from somewhere nearby, maybe the fence or the side of the house. I stopped pulling and looked around again. Nothing, just silence. My pulse hammered in my throat. My breathing was shallow. My gut told me to leave it and go back inside. But I had come this far. I wanted it gone. I pulled once more, harder this time. The bulb popped free, leaving a small piece of wire stuck in the bush. I stood up, holding the bulb in my palm. It had stopped blinking now that I had removed it. It just sat there, dark and lifeless. I turned it over, trying to see if it had any markings. It looked ordinary, cheap, and old. I felt uneasy holding it. I did not want it in my hand. I felt as if something about it was wrong. I walked back toward the house. When I was a few steps from the door, the porch light flickered again. Then it went out completely. I cursed under my breath and fumbled in my pocket for my keys, but realized I had left the door unlocked. I grabbed the knob and stepped inside quickly, locking the door behind me. Once inside, I flipped the kitchen switch. The kitchen lights were dim and buzzing slightly. I tossed the bulb on the table and stared at it. It looked harmless now. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling my heart still racing. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm down. Then I walked back into the living room. The lamps flickered once more. I took a step toward the window that faced the backyard. Before removing the bulb, when I had stood here, the mysterious light blinked faster if I got close. Now that I had removed it, I expected nothing. But as I looked out the window, I noticed something. The bush outside was now glowing steadily with a bright white light. It was not blinking anymore. This made no sense. I had the bulb. I was holding it a moment ago. It was on my kitchen table now. But outside, I could see a steady white light in the exact spot where I had found the bulb. My stomach felt tight. I thought maybe I had grabbed the wrong bulb. Maybe there were two. I hurried back to the kitchen, grabbed the bulb from the table, and returned to the window. The bulb in my hand was dark and dead. The bush in the backyard was lit up as if a small flashlight were hidden inside. I could see the branches clearly outlined. The fog swirled around them. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hands were shaking. I realized the feeling of being watched had intensified. I locked all the doors and checked the windows. I lowered the blinds in the living room. Then I turned all the lights on inside the house. The power flickered again. I stepped back from the window, breathing hard. I tried to think logically. Maybe there was some reflection, or maybe I had disturbed something that caused a short circuit. But none of that explained the feeling in my gut. I could feel my face getting hot with fear. I noticed sweat trickling down the back of my neck. I moved to the hallway and stood there, listening. The house was quiet except for a faint humming sound from the fridge. I heard no voices, no footsteps outside. Yet I could not shake the sense that someone or something watched me. I returned to the kitchen and placed the bulb inside a drawer. I closed it and tried to act normal. I made myself a glass of water, sipped it, and tried to think of what to do next. The idea of going outside again made me feel sick. I stayed inside. After a few minutes, I forced myself to look out the window again. This time, the light in the bush was steady and brighter than before. It did not blink or flicker. It was just there, shining with a cold white glow. The rest of the yard looked dark. Only that spot glowed. I felt my heart pounding. My knees felt weak. I backed away and sat on the couch. I tried to watch TV to distract myself, but the TV signal flickered as well. I turned it off. I paced around the living room, breathing fast. My throat felt dry. Every few minutes I peeked through the blinds. The light never stopped shining. I could not sleep that night. I stayed up, sitting in the living room chair, facing the window. Around 4 or 5 in the morning, the light outside finally started to dim. By the time the sky began to lighten, the glow in the bush had disappeared. I waited until it was fully morning, until I could see the yard clearly in the daylight. When the sun rose, I felt safer. I opened the blinds fully. Outside, the bush looked normal except for one detail. Where the bulb had been, there was now a twisted, bare branch sticking out at an odd angle. No light, no bulb, nothing. The yard looked empty and plain. The fog had lifted. I could see the fence, the neighbor's house beyond it, the patches of grass. Everything was normal. I went outside, still in my jacket. I checked the bush closely. There was no sign of any wire or bulb, just that twisted branch, bent and cracked as if something had pulled on it. I felt no presence now, no strange tension. The air was calm and dry. My porch light worked fine again. The kitchen lights were steady. I went back inside, opened the drawer, and checked the bulb I had taken. It was gone. The drawer was empty except for a few old batteries. I had placed it there the night before, but now it was missing. I searched the kitchen floor, the counters, everywhere. Nothing. I spent the rest of the day feeling uneasy and tired. I locked the doors and kept checking the backyard window every hour. There was nothing unusual anymore, just the yard, the fence, and the quiet December air. I never found that bulb again, and I never saw the strange light in the bush again. I tried to tell myself it was some electrical trick, maybe a prank or a faulty wire. But I knew that made no sense. I had experienced it all firsthand. I had seen the light react to my movements. I had held the bulb, and I had seen the steady glow afterward. Yet by morning, it was all gone, leaving just a bent branch and a feeling I cannot explain. I did not tell anyone about it. It sounded too strange. I just kept quiet, replaced a few of my indoor bulbs, and tried to forget the tension I had felt. I made sure to check my backyard more often after that, but nothing odd ever happened again. Still, every December night since then, I think about that single blinking light and the feeling of being watched. Even now, I remember my heart pounding and the sweat on my palms as I stared at that strange glow outside my window, unsure what it was or why it was there. I remember the first postcard arriving about 2 weeks before Christmas. It was late afternoon. I had just come home from work. I stepped into my small living room, dropped my bag on the couch, and noticed a strange envelope on the kitchen table. I didn't remember bringing in the mail yet, but there it was, a plain white envelope. No stamp, no address, no return label. It was just there. I checked the door, still locked. The windows were closed. I had no idea how it got inside. I approached it slowly. My heart beat a bit faster. The envelope felt smooth and light. I opened it and pulled out a small Christmas card. It was a simple card, no pictures, just a short printed message. Have a memorable December. That was all. No signature, no clue who sent it. I felt uneasy. I looked around the room, checking if something was off. Everything seemed normal. The card was plain, the paper slightly rough, and the letters printed in a dark green ink. I thought maybe I had brought it in with the rest of the mail earlier in a hurry. I checked my jacket pockets. Empty. I opened the front door and looked at the mailbox outside. There was nothing inside. The snow had started to fall, covering the front steps. I closed the door and decided to ignore it. Maybe it was a prank. I put the card back on the table and tried to relax. I turned on the TV, poured myself a glass of water, and tried to think of other things. The next morning, before leaving for work, I grabbed the mail, mostly junk and a few bills. Inside the mailbox, I found another identical envelope. Again, no address, no name, no return label. I opened it right there in my hallway. It contained another card with the same message. Have a memorable December. I felt a chill in my stomach. Now it was clearly not just an accident. Someone was leaving these in my mailbox. I stuffed it in my bag and went to work. All day I kept thinking about those cards. When I got home that evening, I lined them up on my table. 2 identical cards, both saying the same thing. I looked closely at them. The edges were neat. The ink looked uniform. The handwriting was not handwriting at all, more like a printed font. I noticed small scratches on the wooden surface of my table where I placed them. I ran my finger over the scratches. They were short, thin lines, as if something sharp had lightly scraped the surface. I didn't remember those marks before. Maybe I had done it by accident, placing something heavy there a long time ago. I tried not to overthink it. The next morning, I checked the mailbox again. Nothing at first glance. I reached inside and felt a thin envelope stuck at the back. Another card, identical. Now I had 3. Each day a new one appeared. The snow kept falling outside, making my neighborhood look empty. The cold was intense. I tried turning up my heater, but it never felt warm enough. At night, I sat in my living room wearing a sweater and thick socks, but I still felt cold. The windows were closed, and there were no drafts that I could see. Yet the air inside my home felt thin and chilly. As the days passed, the pile of cards grew. Each day, I found one more card in the mailbox. I started looking for footprints in the snow outside. The mailbox stood next to my front step. The snow covered the walkway, and I saw my own footprints clearly. But I never found anyone else's. It was as if the cards appeared without anyone physically coming near the house. The idea unsettled me. I checked the back door, the side windows, even peeked out at odd hours of the night, hoping to catch someone in the act. I saw no one, just falling snow, bare trees, and empty streets. I tried to throw the cards away once. I gathered them up. By then I had about 7, and tossed them in the kitchen trash. Later that night, I heard a soft rustling sound coming from the kitchen. I went to check and found the trash lid slightly open. The cards had spilled out onto the floor. I must not have closed the bag properly. I picked them up and placed them back on the table where they had been before. I didn't know why I did that. I guess I felt like I shouldn't disrespect them, as crazy as that sounds. They were just pieces of paper, but something about them made me nervous. By the time I had around 10 cards, the scratches on my table had multiplied. Every time I placed a new card down, I noticed more short, thin scratch marks in the wood. I ran my fingernail over them. They were shallow but noticeable. I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but no. The surface was definitely getting more marked up. I started laying a cloth down before placing the cards, hoping to protect the wood. Still, I ended up seeing tiny marks on the cloth too, as if needles had pricked it. The temperature in the house kept dropping. I had my thermostat set high, but I still shivered at night. I added extra blankets to my bed. Sometimes I woke up at 2 or 3 in the morning feeling like ice water ran through my veins. I'd get up, checked the furnace, and find nothing wrong. I called a technician who said everything was working fine. He looked at me strangely when I insisted that the house felt colder than it should. Maybe I was getting sick, he suggested. But I felt physically fine, apart from the chill. I stopped going out at night. I felt safer inside, though I wasn't sure why I felt threatened outside. The mailbox turned into a source of dread. Each morning, I opened it with a knot in my stomach. Another card, the same message, the same bland greeting. Have a memorable December. By now, it felt like a threat rather than a wish. I tried asking around the neighborhood, but most people were out of town or staying quiet. It was a tough winter, and I didn't know my neighbors well. The few I asked said they received normal mail, nothing strange. I started examining the cards more thoroughly. The paper felt ordinary. The ink seemed standard. I looked at them under a strong lamp. Nothing unusual. I turned them over. On the backs, all blank, except for the very last one I received, about 2 days before Christmas. That last card had a small dark dot on the back, near the corner. I squinted at it. It looked like a tiny ink stain. I scratched it with my fingernail. It didn't come off. I felt a surge of anxiety. This was the first sign of something different. All the previous cards were identical. Why did this one have a mark? I placed that last card on top of the others. The pile was about 1/2 inch thick now. I heard a faint scraping sound as I did that. I froze. The noise came from under the stack. I lifted the cards quickly. The table now had a cluster of tiny scratch marks. They formed no pattern I could recognize, but they were more numerous than before. My hands shook. I reached out and touched them. The scratches were real. I rubbed my palm on the table's surface. It felt rougher than I remembered. I took all the cards and shoved them in a drawer. I slammed it shut. The drawer squeaked. I walked around the house trying to calm down. It was late afternoon, getting dark. I turned on the lights. They flickered slightly, which they never did before. I felt a drop of sweat roll down my temple even though it was cold. My stomach cramped. I realized I was hungry but had no appetite. I tried calling a friend, but he didn't pick up. I left a message telling him something strange was going on. I didn't mention the cards. I felt stupid. What would I say? Night fell. I turned on the TV for background noise. A few hours passed. I dozed off on the couch. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The TV was still on, muted. The lights in the living room were dimmer than usual. I glanced at the thermostat. It read the correct temperature, but I felt cold air on my skin. I got up and walked to the kitchen. I paused at the drawer where I had placed the cards. Something urged me to open it. I didn't want to, but I couldn't resist. I opened the drawer. The cards were gone. The drawer was empty except for a few random utensils. I stepped back, breathing hard. I searched the kitchen. I opened cabinets, checked the floor, the trash, everywhere. No cards. They couldn't just vanish, unless I moved them and forgot. But I knew I hadn't. I stood there, my fingers numb, my chest tight. I ran to the front door and opened it. Cold air rushed in. I looked at the mailbox in the faint light from the street lamp. It was open, too. I swear I had closed it after last time I checked. I stepped outside in my slippers and pajamas, shivering. I reached into the mailbox. Nothing inside, just cold metal. I looked around the yard. Snow covered everything. The sky was clear. The street was silent. No footprints, no tracks. I went back inside, locking the door. I spent the rest of the night awake, pacing. I felt scared. I felt watched. The silence in my house grew heavier. I pressed my ear against the walls, thinking I might hear something. Just silence and the faint hum of the heater. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but I kept looking at the kitchen drawer. The cards were gone. I didn't know what that meant. Where did they go? Did I imagine them? By morning, I felt exhausted. I checked the mailbox at dawn, half expecting another card. It was empty. I checked again at noon, still empty. For the first time in days, no new card arrived. I didn't know if I should feel relieved or worried. I searched the house again, looking for any sign of those cards. Not a single one. The scratches on the table remained as proof I hadn't imagined it. I stared at those marks for a long time. They reminded me of tiny claw marks, but I pushed that thought away. I didn't want to think about that. The rest of the day was calm. The temperature inside the house felt normal again. The lights didn't flicker. I watched TV, did some laundry, tried to relax. I still jumped at small sounds. A branch tapping against the window made my heart race. But there were no more messages, no more strange envelopes. As Christmas approached, I found myself on edge, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. No more cards appeared. The mailbox remained empty, except for normal junk mail and a holiday card from my aunt. The scratches on my table stayed there, a reminder of those mysterious postcards. I never discovered who left them or why. The small, dark dot on the last card was still stuck in my memory. I wondered what it meant. I tried telling a close friend about it after the holidays. He looked confused and said maybe I was stressed from work or the weather. He thought maybe I had gotten some weird promotional cards and imagined the rest. I dropped the subject. I knew what I had seen. I had felt the chill in my bones, seen the scratches appear, watched the lights flicker. But I had no proof now. The cards were gone. My house returned to normal, as if it never happened. In the quiet days after Christmas, I sometimes sat at the kitchen table and ran my hand over the scratches. They were real, tangible marks in the wood. I didn't own a pet, and I never dragged anything sharp across the table. They appeared during those weeks of receiving the postcards. I knew that much, but I couldn't explain it. Occasionally, at night, I woke up feeling cold again. Not as bad as before, but a mild chill. I'd get up, drink water, walk around the house. Everything would be in its place, no disturbances. Just a lingering feeling, a memory of that strange period when I found those cards every day. Cards that wished me a memorable December and then vanished without a trace. By the new year, I tried to move on. I replaced the kitchen table with a new one. I donated the old one to a thrift store. The scratches were gone from my life, but not from my mind. I stopped checking the mailbox nervously. I accepted that I might never know who or what delivered those cards. I took comfort in the fact that they were gone, that the house felt warm again, and that life returned to normal. Still, every December since, I glance at the mailbox a bit more carefully. I feel a slight tension in my chest. I wonder if another plain envelope will appear. So far it hasn't. But if it ever does, I don't know what I'll do. I hope it never comes to that. I have no desire to experience that strange, silent tension again. No desire to see more unexplained scratches or feel that deep, icy cold creeping through my home. In the end, I'm left with nothing but questions. I know what happened. I saw it. I felt it. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. No explanation, no closure, just silence and the memory of a December that I will never forget. I remember bringing the artificial Christmas tree into my living room in early December. I set it up in the corner near the window. It was a standard 7-foot tree, pre-lit, with branches that I had to fan out. I spent about an hour attaching each section and arranging the branches. I hung some simple ornaments and plugged in the lights. They looked fine. Everything seemed normal at first. On the first night, I sat on the couch and admired the tree. It didn't smell like a real tree, obviously, but it looked decent enough. The lights were white and steady, not blinking. The ornaments were simple glass balls in red, green, and gold. I turned off the overhead lights and let the tree light the room. It was cozy. I felt calm and ready for the holidays. The next morning, I walked into the living room with a cup of coffee. I glanced at the tree. It looked different. I couldn't say how at first. I stood there, sipping my coffee, and realized the top of the tree looked closer to the ceiling. I knew it was supposed to be about 7 feet tall. Now it seemed taller, maybe by a few inches. I shrugged it off. Maybe I hadn't noticed its full height before. I moved on with my day, trying not to think about it. The following morning, the feeling came back. I walked into the living room, and the tree looked even taller. Now it almost touched the ceiling. I ran my hand over the top. It was just an inch or two below the ceiling. I remembered when I first set it up, I had at least a foot of space above it. I was sure of it. I tried to push the top down, but it was stiff. The branches near the top felt firmer. I wondered if I had assembled it incorrectly, maybe missed a piece, but I knew I hadn't. I decided to ignore it and leave it alone. The ornaments still hung in place. The lights were on a timer, so they turned on automatically in the evening. That night, I watched TV with the tree in my peripheral vision. The lights seemed to flicker occasionally, not in a decorative pattern, but in brief, irregular blinks. I checked the plug. It was secure. The wiring looked fine. I made a mental note to buy new lights after the holidays. On the third morning, I entered the room and felt the hairs on my arms stand up. The tree's branches were extending outward. Some touched the wall behind it. Others leaned toward the window. A few branches near the bottom bent at odd angles, sticking out in a way that didn't look natural for a synthetic tree. The ornaments looked dull, not as shiny as before. The glass balls seemed cloudy, as if the coating had faded overnight. I tapped one gently. It didn't break, but it felt colder than I expected. I moved closer to check the lights. They still worked, but now they blinked in random intervals. 2 blinks, then a pause, then 3 blinks, then a pause. I counted. It never repeated the same pattern twice in a row. I unplugged them and then plugged them back in. It made no difference. I tried to take one of the ornaments off to inspect it. As I grabbed a gold ball, I felt a sharp tingle run through my fingers, like a static shock, but stronger. I pulled my hand back. My fingers tingled and my heart raced. I decided to leave the ornaments alone. I didn't know what to do. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the tree looked normal if I didn't stare at it too long. But deep down, I felt uneasy. I considered throwing the tree out, but it was heavy, and I didn't have the energy to drag it outside in the cold. Besides, it was expensive. I told myself to wait and see if the situation got worse. That night, I slept poorly. I kept thinking I heard noises. Around 3 a.m, I woke up suddenly. I heard a faint creaking sound, like plastic bending. It came from the living room. My bedroom door was closed, but I could still hear it. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I tried to ignore it, but the sound continued for a few minutes. Slow, subtle creaks, as if someone were twisting the branches. Finally, it stopped. I lay awake for a long time before I dared to go out and check. When I finally did, I turned on every light I could. The tree stood there, silent, looking the same as before, only maybe the branches were arranged a bit differently. I couldn't prove it, but I sensed it. The next morning was Christmas Eve. The tree now touched the ceiling, its top bent against the plaster. The branches spread out so far that they pressed against the wall. I had to move the couch back a few inches just to walk around it. The ornaments looked almost transparent now, as if all color had drained out. I could see the hooks through the glass. The lights flickered rapidly when I turned them on, so I decided to leave them off. I stood there, breathing fast. The room felt cold. My heater was on, but I still felt a chill. I rubbed my arms and watched the tree. It was just an object, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of me. That sounded insane, but I couldn't help it. I reached out and tried to push a branch back into place. The plastic needles felt rough. I got another static-like shock that made me yank my hand away. I backed off, heart racing. I spent the day avoiding the living room. I stayed in the kitchen and the bedroom, reading or trying to distract myself. I tried calling a friend, but he was busy. I didn't know how to explain the situation anyway. I just said I was feeling uneasy at home. He suggested I go out and see a movie or something, but I didn't want to leave the house. I felt like I needed to watch the tree to make sure it didn't do anything else. That night, I went to bed early but couldn't sleep. I listened from behind my bedroom door, waiting. Sure enough, sometime after midnight, I heard the soft creaking again. It sounded like bending plastic and scraping on the wall. I imagined the branches growing longer, pushing against the paint, maybe leaving marks. I imagined them reaching out into the room. I felt my mouth go dry. My temples throbbed. I got up, grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet, and walked slowly to the door. I opened the bedroom door a crack and peeked out. The hallway was dark. The living room was dark. I saw a faint shape where the tree stood, taller than ever, branches spread wide. I flicked on the hallway light. The creaking stopped immediately. I waited, holding my breath. I turned on the living room light. The tree looked the same as it had that morning. I sighed and lowered the bat. My nerves were on edge. I decided to stay up for a while, watching TV with the volume low. The tree dominated the corner of the room. Even with the lights on, it made me uneasy. Eventually, I dozed off on the couch. I woke up just before sunrise, stiff and cold. I looked at the tree. It stood silently. I got up and stretched, then decided to go make coffee. I walked to the kitchen. When I returned a few minutes later, something was off. I realized the tree was not in the exact same position. It had moved, or at least I thought it had. I couldn't be sure, but I had a strong feeling it was angled differently. The lower branches looked as if they had shifted. I checked the floor. The rug under the tree looked slightly rumpled, as if pulled. I spent the early morning pacing the house, trying to decide what to do. I thought about chopping it up, but I had no tools. I considered dragging it outside, but it was huge now, and I worried about what might happen if I touched it again. I kept touching my hand where I'd felt the shock. It still tingled occasionally, as if some residue lingered. Time passed slowly. By mid-morning, I had decided to get rid of it no matter what. I went to the garage to look for heavy gloves or something to protect my hands. I found an old pair of work gloves. I planned to unplug the lights, remove the ornaments, and break the tree down into sections, just like when I assembled it. Then I would carry it outside piece by piece. If it shocked me again, I'd just endure it. I couldn't live with this thing anymore. I returned to the living room. The tree was gone. I stopped in my tracks, heart thumping hard. The corner was empty. The rug where the tree had stood was wrinkled, with faint drag marks leading toward the door. The ornaments were gone. The lights were gone. Nothing remained except a few bits of green plastic needles scattered on the floor. I approached slowly, holding my breath. I touched the rug with the tip of my foot. It felt normal, just out of place. I looked around the room, confused and panicked. The tree had been too large and heavy for anyone to remove quietly. I had been awake most of the night. I would have heard someone breaking in. The door was locked. The windows were locked. I checked them all, one by one, heart pounding. No sign of forced entry. No footprints in the snow outside. Nothing. Just silence and an empty corner. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I didn't know what to do. I called my friend and tried to explain. He thought I was joking. I assured him I was serious. He said maybe I had moved the tree somewhere else and forgotten. That made no sense, and I told him so. He suggested I call the police, but what would I say? My artificial Christmas tree disappeared on its own? They would think I was crazy or high. I hung up, frustrated. I sat down on the couch and stared at the corner. The room felt strangely bigger now. Without the tree, the tension was gone, but a hollow feeling replaced it. I felt exhausted, like I had been through a terrible ordeal. I touched the floor where the tree had been. The drag marks were real. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the direction they pointed. They led toward the front door, but the door was locked and showed no sign of use. I opened it and stepped outside. Just fresh snow, undisturbed. I spent the rest of the day cleaning up. I vacuumed the needles, straightened the rug, and tried to put the living room back in order. Without the tree, the space felt empty. I sat there in silence, trying to make sense of it. The tree had grown each day, changed shape, dulled its ornaments, flickered its lights in patterns that made no sense. I had felt shocks, heard creaking noises at night. Then, when I finally decided to remove it, it vanished completely. I double-checked my memory. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The scratch marks on the ceiling where the top had pressed proved it wasn't just a dream. There were faint marks where the branches had pushed against the wall's paint. I touched them, and a bit of paint flaked off. The evidence was right in front of me. The tree had been real. Now it was gone. As the day wore on, I locked all my doors and windows and tried to relax. There was no point calling anyone else. They wouldn't believe me. I made dinner, watched some TV, and tried to calm down. The house felt normal again. The temperature was steady. The lights didn't flicker. I slept in my bed that night without hearing any noises. In the morning, everything was the same. The corner remained empty. I never found out what happened to that tree. It never reappeared. I never saw any sign of it again. For the rest of the holiday season, I lived without a Christmas tree. Friends asked why I didn't have one, and I just shrugged. I told them I decided not to decorate this year. Inside, I kept remembering how it felt to stand next to that thing, how my hand tingled when I touched the ornaments, how the branches seemed to stretch on their own. I couldn't explain it. I tried to forget about it, but the memory lingered. In the months that followed, nothing strange occurred in the house. Everything went back to normal. I replaced the paint chips on the wall and ignored the ceiling marks as best I could. Every once in a while I thought I heard a soft creak, but it was always just the house settling. I told myself that's all it was. I never bought another artificial tree. The next Christmas, I put a small, real tree on a stand, kept it simple, and took it out before it dried up. No strange sounds, no changes in height, just a normal holiday decoration, as it should be. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I remember that final morning. The empty corner, the drag marks on the rug, the faint green needles scattered on the floor, and I feel that tightness in my chest again, that sense that something impossible happened right in front of me. I guess I'll never know the truth. At least it's gone now, and I can live in peace. Remember that week in December? The weather turned colder than usual, and my house felt damp and stale. I live alone in a small house with a glass-enclosed veranda. It's a simple space with old wooden chairs, a small table, and large glass panels that look out onto my backyard. Normally, I keep the veranda closed off during winter, but the cold had seeped inside more than usual. The air felt heavier than normal. On the first night, I noticed something strange. It was around 7 in the evening. I finished eating a quick meal and went to the veranda to check the thermostat I keep out there. I wanted to confirm how cold it had gotten. When I entered, I immediately saw a thin layer of frost on the inside of the glass panels. The frost was not unusual by itself, but it surprised me that it had formed inside and not just outside. I stepped closer, my breath condensing on the glass. I ran a finger lightly over the frosted surface. It felt rough and cold. Then I noticed faint marks, like smudges or streaks on the glass. They looked like they had been made by someone's fingertips. At first, I thought maybe I touched it without remembering, but the marks were too high and at an odd angle. There were several uneven lines, like someone had lightly pressed their fingers into the frost. I leaned in, my forehead almost touching the glass. I tried to see if the marks formed any shape. It was unclear, just random curved lines and squiggles. I assumed condensation and uneven frost caused it. I shrugged it off and returned inside. That night, I slept poorly. The house felt colder than I liked, and even though I turned up the heat, the chill lingered. I woke at around 2 in the morning, thirsty. I walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. Passing by the doorway to the veranda, I noticed a faint glow from the yard security light. I paused, feeling a strange tension in my chest. My skin tingled. I decided to check the glass panels again, just to ease my mind. I pulled the veranda door open, letting in a draft of cold air. It was quiet. The wooden floor creaked under my slippers. I aimed my flashlight at the glass. Now there were more marks. Thin, finger-like streaks covered a larger area. They seemed bolder. They twisted and curved, forming vague shapes. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what they resembled, but something about them felt deliberate. My heart beat faster. I looked around. The veranda door was locked. The backyard was still, covered in a thin layer of snow. No footprints, no signs of anyone sneaking around. The marks were on the inside anyway. That was impossible. I went back inside quickly and locked the veranda door again. I told myself it must be some strange pattern formed by moisture. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept returning to those finger-like marks. Eventually, I fell into a light sleep, waking early with a slight headache. In the morning, I checked the veranda again. The frost had melted a bit as the sun rose, leaving the glass mostly clear. The marks were gone. The glass looked normal again. I felt relieved. Maybe I imagined it. I spent the day running errands, trying not to think about it. But as evening came, I grew uneasy. The temperature dropped again, and I noticed the heater working harder than usual. The living room felt chilly despite the thermostat reading normal. I put on a sweater and tried to watch TV. Around 9 at night, I felt drawn to the veranda again. I turned on the hallway light and walked slowly toward it. I could feel my heart beating harder than normal. I opened the door and shined a flashlight at the glass. The frost was back, thicker this time, and now the marks were clearer. They formed a rough pattern that looked almost like a human face. Not a perfect face, but something resembling eyes and a mouth, distorted and uneven. It was like someone had pressed their fingertips into the frost, outlining a crude face. My throat tightened. I took a step forward, my hand trembling slightly. I reached out to wipe the marks away. As soon as my hand touched the cold glass, I felt a chill run through my fingers up into my wrist. I wiped hard, using my sleeve to clear a patch of frost. The marks disappeared under the fabric. Satisfied, I stepped back, but in seconds, new lines began forming right before my eyes. They started faint, then became darker, as if an invisible finger traced them from the other side. I backed away, breathing fast. I watched these lines curve into a long, thin smile and two hollow spots where eyes might be. My stomach clenched, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I left the veranda, closed the door, and locked it. My hand shook as I turned off the lights and returned to the living room. I paced around, not sure what to do. Calling someone seemed ridiculous. What would I say? That frost on my veranda was forming faces on the inside of the glass. They would think I was joking or stressed. I decided to stay awake. I put on the kettle, made some tea, and tried to calm down. I checked the thermostat again, cranking the heat a bit more. The house still felt cold, like some of the outside chill had seeped in deeper. Around midnight, I heard a soft creaking sound. It came from the veranda door. I froze, holding my breath. I listened carefully. Nothing else, just silence and the faint hum of the heater. I decided to look again, even though every part of me wanted to ignore it. I carried a flashlight and approached the door quietly. My muscles felt tense. I opened the door just a crack and shined the light. The face on the frost was still there, only now the lines seemed sharper. The eyes were more defined. The mouth curved upward slightly, like a subtle grin. I felt my throat go dry. I wanted to shout at it, to tell it to stop, but I said nothing. Instead, I shut the door and returned to the living room. I turned on every light in the house, trying to chase away that unsettling feeling. I couldn't call the police for this. I couldn't call my friends at this hour. I sat on the couch, holding a blanket, waiting for the night to end. I must have dozed off because I woke up to a dim morning light. The clock read 6:30. I rubbed my eyes and stood up, my neck stiff. I tiptoed to the veranda, heart pounding. With the rising sun, the frost should have melted. I prayed the marks were gone. I opened the door and looked. The glass was clear. No frost, no face, no strange lines, just the backyard visible through the clean glass. I exhaled slowly. Maybe this was some bizarre hallucination. Maybe I was too tired, too stressed. I tried to go about my day as if nothing happened. I worked from home, typing away at my laptop, trying to focus. But every so often, I glanced down the hall toward the veranda door. The memory of that face made my stomach flip. As evening approached, I became restless again. The sun set early in December, and by late afternoon, the temperature dropped quickly. My furnace clicked on, humming loudly, struggling to keep the house warm. At around 7, I went to check the veranda again, dreading what I might see. This time, I wore gloves. I didn't want to feel that cold shock again. I opened the door slowly. The frost was back, even thicker. The layer of ice clung to the inside of the glass. My breath fogged as I stepped closer. I shined the flashlight carefully across the surface. At first, I saw nothing but random streaks. Then, as if drawn by an invisible hand, the lines began to form again. I watched in horror as they slowly shaped into that vague face. The lines were shaky but deliberate. 2 spots for eyes, a line for a nose, and that same unnerving smile. My heartbeat echoed in my skull. I reached out with my gloved hand and wiped at the face again, pressing hard. The gloves squeaked against the glass. The face vanished, replaced by a smear of melted frost. I stepped back, determined to watch closely this time. Within seconds, new lines emerged, just as before. They moved as if a finger were tracing from the opposite side. The eyes appeared first, then the mouth. The mouth curved slightly upward again, like it knew I was watching. My chest felt tight, and my hands shook. I backed away, slamming the veranda door shut. I locked it and pulled the curtains over it. I didn't want to see that face anymore. I stood there in the hallway, trying to breathe steadily. My hands were cold and sweaty. I thought about leaving the house, going to a hotel. But it was late, and the roads were icy. Also, I was afraid to go outside. What if something waited for me there? I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the door handle to the veranda. It made me feel a bit safer. I turned the heat up as far as it would go. The furnace rattled and hissed, struggling to raise the temperature. I paced the living room, hugging myself. The air still felt too cold. I considered calling someone, maybe a friend who lived nearby. But I stopped, realizing how insane the story sounded. I decided to try cleaning the glass in the morning. Maybe if I thoroughly cleaned it with warm water and soap, the frost wouldn't form on the inside again. Maybe I could solve this. I waited out the night. Every noise made me flinch. I heard faint tapping sounds at one point. I told myself it was just the house settling. The hours dragged by. Eventually, the sky lightened. Morning came slowly, and with it, a small measure of courage. At dawn, I removed the chair from the door and opened it. The glass was clean, no frost, no face, just as it had been the previous morning. I sighed and stepped closer, examining every inch. The glass felt cold but normal. I fetched a bucket of warm water and some cleaning supplies. I scrubbed the glass thoroughly, inside and out. I dried it with a towel until it gleamed. I tried to ignore the trembling in my fingers. The rest of the day passed quietly. The house felt warmer in the afternoon sun. I thought maybe I had fixed it. Maybe the cleaning prevented the frost from forming. Still, I was on edge as evening approached. The shadows lengthened, and the air outside grew colder. I prepared myself, checking the furnace and making sure all doors and windows were locked. I ate a light dinner and sat in the living room, keeping the veranda curtains closed. I told myself not to look, but around 9 that night, my curiosity got the better of me. I stood up, hands shaking, and approached the curtains. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my throat. Finally, I pulled them back just a little and peeked. I saw a faint layer of frost again. I felt my body tense up. I couldn't see details from this angle, so I opened the veranda door a crack and looked through the gap. The frost was there, forming again, and as I watched, the lines started to appear. They formed the same vague face, only this time the eyes looked slightly larger, and the mouth seemed wider. I shuddered, my knees weak. I quietly shut the door, locked it, and closed the curtains. I didn't try to wipe it this time. I didn't want another shock, another futile attempt. I just sat in the living room, listening to the faint creaking sounds. Eventually, I dozed off from exhaustion. When I woke, it was early morning. The sky was pale and the house was silent. I pulled the curtains back again. The glass was clear. Nothing but my backyard was visible, empty and still. This pattern repeated itself for several more nights. Each night, as the temperature fell, the frost appeared and the face returned. Each morning, it vanished. I tried ignoring it, but the tension weighed on me. I felt watched. When I approached that glass, my skin prickled and my stomach twisted. After a few days, I stopped bothering to wipe the frost. I knew it would come back. I considered staying elsewhere, but I kept hoping it would stop. Finally, after about a week, the weather warmed slightly. The frost became weaker each night. The face looked less defined, the lines more shallow. Then, on a mild morning, I realized the frost had not formed at all the previous night. The glass was completely clear. I stood there, staring through it at the backyard. There was no sign of those marks, no hint of the strange events. The house felt warmer, and the tension had eased. But I still feel uneasy sometimes. I catch myself glancing at the veranda glass, expecting to see that faint face staring back at me. The memory still makes my heart race. I never told anyone the full story. There's nothing to show for it now. No marks, no proof. Just my own recollection of those silent nights, the frost-covered glass, and the faint shape of an impossible face staring back at me through the cold. The sensation of being watched never truly left me. Even in warmer months, when the glass stays clear, I sometimes wake at night and think I see something move on the other side. I tell myself it's just my imagination. But I'll never forget the feeling of standing there, inches away, while those lines formed a face that seemed to know I was there. I'm just glad it's over, and I hope it never comes back.